Chapter 1689. P.S. Read the exclusive story behind Extraordinary Primeval World and listen to your suggestions for the novel. Follow the official account. WeChat add friends, add the official account, type DD, and tell me secretly. It was precisely because of this consideration. Therefore, Luo Fan naturally needed to increase the cultivation realm of his physical body as much as possible. And it was only natural for him to increase his cultivation realm and enter a world that was compatible with his current cultivation realm of his physical body. The endless world within the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was divided into 9 levels according to the profoundness contained in it. The 4th level was close to the center of the 9 levels. Similar to the other worlds of different levels, this world looked extremely ordinary and did not reveal anything special. However, after careful observation and sensing, one could tell that the profoundness contained in this world was almost all the profoundness of the worlds below the 3rd level that he had experienced before. Even though none of the 5 worlds of Luo Fan's false saints were involved in this 4th level world, after stepping into this world, he could still sense all kinds of inexplicable responses from this world that were transmitted to his physical body. This feeling was completely different from when he entered the 9th level world. Indeed, the higher the level, the better. Only the most suitable for me is the best for me. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. This level 4 world was completely different from the level 9 world, which made him have a deeper understanding of this point. The current Luo Fan had already formed an indescribable resonance with the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and had become its master in a certain form. The difference in their relationship made him want to cultivate. That feeling was already completely different from before. After he entered this 4th level world, in a single breath, endless profoundness was released from the great Tao of this world and slowly injected into his physical body. It was quickly guided by the cultivation method of his physical body and continuously pushed this cultivation method forward. It evolved in the direction of becoming stronger. This method of directly refining profoundness was something that he could not do in the past. With a thought, Luo Fan suddenly revealed an inexplicable smile on his face. It was at this moment that he had an indescribable inspiration. With this inspiration, he raised his hand and gently patted his body. With this pat, his body trembled slightly. Suddenly, an indescribable power surged out of nowhere and began to roam inside and outside of his body, moving continuously. Before long, an indescribable object shot out from the top of his head as his power trembled. This mass of things was so mysterious. It was so unbelievable. The void constantly twisted and spiraled, as if countless worlds were being born and destroyed. There were also endless words, runes, diagrams, and many other things that were constantly spiraling and evolving. After this mass appeared, it began to emit some kind of invisible light. This light engulfed the entire world in the blink of an eye, causing all space-time and everything in this world to disappear. They were all wrapped up in this light. Next, the world connected directly to the void. It connected through space-time and seeped directly into the unseen world. It enveloped the great Tao of this world, and began to suck out endless profoundness from the great Tao as if it was sucking blood. It was then transferred to this mass of things through the light. This caused the various lights and shadows within this mass of things to undergo indescribable changes. It was as if it was growing indescribably because of the many nutrients and the lights and shadows. It can really be like this? Luo Fan looked up at this mass of things and smiled. This mass of things was indescribable. It was none other than the cultivation method of his flesh and blood body. The higher the level of things, the more mysterious they were. This seemed to be the case for cultivation method. If it were the martial arts methods of mortals, they would just be ordinary things that could be recorded on ordinary paper. There was nothing mysterious or special about them. No matter how it was changed or destroyed, as long as it could be reassembled in the end, it would be a perfect cultivation method. However, If it were the cultivation method of a cultivator who had yet to become an immortal, it would be different. That was not a mysterious method that could be recorded on ordinary paper. Only some special power or special materials could be used as a carrier to record it. After it was recorded, it could naturally emit an inexplicable power that could affect any living being that looked at it. According to the different nature of the cultivation method, it would produce all kinds of unimaginable consequences. In fact, even if it was destroyed or messed up, it would cause serious consequences, causing it to have to be reassembled and sorted out before it could be used again. Otherwise, its power would be greatly reduced. If the level of the cultivation method was raised to the level of an immortal, the changes would be even more mysterious than the cultivation method of an ordinary cultivator. Its power would be even more terrifying, and it would be even more difficult to reassemble it after it was destroyed. Just like that, the higher the level, the more mysterious the cultivation method would be. And when the level of the cultivation method was raised to the level of Luo Fan's flesh and blood body, which was the level of the multi-world false sage, this cultivation method had already become some kind of indescribable special living being. This kind of living being had the instinct to evolve on its own and the desire to work hard to improve itself. It could also exist independently and form an indescribable whole. If it was attacked, it might even launch a counterattack. This was the characteristic of such a multi-world false sage-level cultivation technique. These various characteristics allowed Luo Fan's current cultivation method of flesh and blood to be able to separate from his body in an extremely inconceivable manner and directly take form in the sky. Then, it started to absorb the boundless profundities to strengthen itself and evolve itself. However, this wasn't without any restrictions. If this world had not yet resonated with Luo Fan's flesh and blood, even if Luo Fan clearly knew that this cultivation method had such characteristics, he would not have been able to do so. It could evolve and improve naturally without needing him to interfere or take any action. He would never do that. That was because this cultivation method was only a cultivation method after all. Even if there were all kinds of unbelievable powers and unimaginable abilities, it could not change the fact that it was a cultivation method. This was a reality. This made it extremely easy for this cultivation method to be seized by others. If any Supreme Emperor took advantage of the time when the cultivation technique was empty and directly attacked to seize this cultivation technique, the cultivation technique would resist a little because the nature of the emperor who seized it was different from the emperor, and it would show various signs of resistance. However, this was nothing compared to the strength of a supreme emperor. They did not need to go through too much trouble. As long as they had the strength to force any other supreme emperor to retreat, they would be able to destroy the resistance of this cultivation method and then take it for themselves. Even if that was the case, it was unlikely that these supreme emperors would be able to reach the same realm as Luo Fan's flesh and blood through this cultivation method that was completely suitable for Luo Fan. It was also impossible for them to rely on this cultivation method to obtain their true Tao. However, it would definitely be beneficial to them and would be enough to become resources for them to comprehend their own Tao. Therefore, at that time, Luo Fan had never thought of releasing this cultivation method. He wanted it to grow on its own. However, it was different now. To a certain extent, he had already become the owner of this natural, inextinguishable spiritual light. Almost all the power within the natural, inextinguishable spiritual light was under his control. Under such circumstances, he only needed to slightly mobilize the power of this natural, inextinguishable spiritual light to protect this cultivation method, and no supreme emperor would be able to break through its defense. To obtain this cultivation method, it was precisely because he understood this that Luo Fan had the idea of releasing this cultivation method to grow on its own. He was also truly sure that this cultivation method really had such an ability, Looking at the cultivation method above his head that was constantly changing and growing, Luo Fan finally heaved a sigh of relief. He was rather busy now. Not only did he need this cultivation method to grow, but he also needed to comprehend the state of chaos. He also needed to move the connate inextinguishable spirit light away. He didn't have much time to waste on this seemingly endless process of cultivating this cultivation method and nurturing his body of flesh and blood. Now that he could let this cultivation method grow on its own, he could completely free his mind to do other things. To him, this was naturally a great thing. How could he not feel much more relaxed? After taking a look at the cultivation method, Luo Fan did not waste any time. With a thought, among the endless worlds within the natural inextinguishable spiritual light, countless worlds began to emit boundless light. These lights rapidly gathered from all directions in the fourth-tier world that Luo Fan was currently in. In the blink of an eye, they had completely broken through the barriers of the worlds and directly arrived at where Luo Fan was. They began to quickly gather around the cultivation method. Of course, these lights were not the natural inextinguishable spiritual light, although the natural inextinguishable spiritual light was the easiest to gather from the countless worlds. It clearly did not mean that only the natural inextinguishable spiritual light could be gathered from the various worlds. These lights were impressively a part of the natural inextinguishable spiritual light. Of course, it was only an extremely insignificant and small part. These endless lights gathered in one place and finally formed a small stream of natural inextinguishable spiritual light. In fact, compared to the natural inextinguishable spiritual light that Tong Huang had unleashed when he was refined by the natural inextinguishable spiritual light and possessed by the will of the natural inextinguishable spiritual light, it was countless times smaller. However, that was the natural inextinguishable spiritual light after all. Its own nature determined that it was many levels higher than any other supreme emperor. After this insignificant innate spirit light appeared, it slightly rotated and directly wrapped Luo Fan's fleshly body cultivation technique in that spirit light. Immediately after, the spiritual light shook slightly and a powerful force seeped out from it. It directly turned the cultivation method into an illusory shadow and no longer existed. After a brief test, Luo Fan nodded in satisfaction. Now, even if it was him, before this small stream of natural inextinguishable spiritual light, it would be difficult for him to come into contact with the cultivation method of the physical body. If even he could not do it, he did not believe that any other supreme emperor would be able to do it. With a thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and waved it lightly. In an instant, in a certain world within the natural inextinguishable spiritual light, Ming Huang, who was enjoying the fun of walking around in that world, felt a call from Luo Fan. He took a step forward and his figure directly traversed through layers of time and space, directly arriving in the world where Luo Fan was, appearing not far from Luo Fan. Try and see if you can seize this cultivation method. Luo Fan looked at Ming Huang, who had already been refined by the natural inextinguishable spiritual light, and said calmly. Ming Huang had already been refined by the natural inextinguishable spiritual light. His thoughts and actions were all based on the natural inextinguishable spiritual light. From the perspective of the natural inextinguishable spiritual light. To him, Luo Fan, who had resonated with the natural inextinguishable spiritual light, to a certain extent, could represent the natural inextinguishable spiritual light. Therefore, no matter what order Luo Fan gave, even if he wanted him to commit suicide, or to plot against his own body, he would not hesitate to execute it. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan wanted him to try and seize the cultivation method. Naturally, he would not have the slightest hesitation. Nodding his head, Ming Huang immediately acted. Suddenly, rays of spiritual light gushed out from his body and turned into a palm in the void, directly reaching for the cultivation method. The palm formed by the spiritual light flashed with a faint white radiance. Within it, there were bits and pieces of eternal indestructibility. It had the charm of being indestructible by 10,000 tribulations. Obviously, it had the innate characteristic of the natural inextinguishable spiritual light. After the palm was formed, the entire world trembled slightly, as if the appearance of the spiritual light palm had already caused all sorts of subtle changes. At this moment, Luo Fan could clearly feel that there was a faint change in the great Tao of this world. In this world, there seemed to be some kind of change in the great Tao. It was as if the appearance of the hand had activated something, causing the great Tao to become even more resplendent and mysterious. As expected of a fourth-level world, compared to ordinary worlds, it has a stronger endurance. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The changes in the world before him clearly showed that the power of the spiritual light palm had broken through the limits of ordinary worlds, causing the potential of this world to be slightly stimulated, releasing a power that was stronger than ordinary worlds. Of course, this kind of power could not last long. Once the spiritual light palm disappeared, the entire group of worlds, or rather, the power of the connate inextinguishable spirit light, would naturally calm down this change, allowing this world to return to its original appearance. This place would no longer be any different from before. Although these thoughts took a long time, to Luo Fan it was just a flash. Almost in the blink of an eye, he had already understood everything. At this moment, the spiritual light palm had already reached into the tiny connate inextinguishable spirit light that Luo Fan had condensed, grabbing at the cultivation method on Luo Fan's body. However, at this moment, the connate inextinguishable spirit light trembled slightly, and an indescribable power poured into the spiritual light palm, causing the connate inextinguishable spirit light on the spiritual light palm to suddenly freeze and then completely disperse, as if it had never appeared. This scene looked like after the palm reached into the tiny connate inextinguishable spirit light, its power seemed to increase greatly, and endless light suddenly shone out. If someone who didn't know what was going on saw this, they might praise Emperor Ming's superb methods. However, it was a pity that this was clearly not the case. At this moment, under the effect of the tiny connate inextinguishable spirit light, the spiritual light palm trembled, and bits of spiritual light began to scatter in all directions. In the end, the entire spiritual light palm was like a pile of fine sand, and it began to scatter in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already disappeared without a trace. At this moment, there was a trace of shock in Emperor Ming's eyes. Amidst this shock, he did not hesitate to attack again, and endless spiritual light surged out from his body. Along with this spiritual light, from the endless world inside the connate inextinguishable spirit light, countless rays of light and power surged out, and they began to rapidly condense around this world. In the blink of an eye, the endless power had already condensed together with the spiritual light around Emperor Ming's body. At this moment, the spiritual light began to change. It began to change rapidly. Its structure began to undergo an earth-shattering change. Countless tiny space and time were formed within the spiritual light in just a short instant. This originally pure spiritual light had already transformed into a different existence. It had transformed into a simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light. For a supreme emperor like Emperor Ming, being refined by this connate inextinguishable spirit light was indeed a misfortune. It was a fate of losing one's fundamental freedom, and it was a fate that most supreme emperors would rather die than suffer. However, at the same time, this process also caused the mysteries of the connate inextinguishable spirit light to pour into the depths of these supreme emperors' memories at an indescribable speed, fusing with their instincts. This allowed them to obtain the endless mysteries of the connate inextinguishable spirit light without going through arduous comprehension, and without needing to comprehend it for a long time. These various mysteries that were naturally poured in were not enough for Emperor Ming to directly construct the connate inextinguishable spirit light. However, it was enough for him to construct the simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light, just like now after the simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light appeared, this fourth-level world began to undergo even greater changes. In the void, there were even bits and pieces of light gushing out. The laws and principles of this world began to become more and more complicated and mysterious during this process, and the great Tao became even brighter. Among them, the connate inextinguishable spirit light that was originally lying in the depths of the great Tao seemed to be in a deep sleep. The endless mysteries seemed to have been awakened at this moment, and it began to produce all sorts of incredible powers. It caused all sorts of jaw-dropping consequences. At this moment, all the living beings in this entire world could feel that this entire world was undergoing this indescribable change. All sorts of guesses, fears, and excitement began to spread throughout this entire world at this moment. I didn't expect such a change to occur when a stronger power enters this high-level world. This connate inextinguishable spirit light is really mysterious. Luo Fan looked at this scene, and an indescribable feeling appeared on his face. Although he had entered many high-level worlds, he had never really fought with any existences in this high-level world. Even before and after the discussion with the Ju Huang, he had only used words to exchange blows, and did not really fight. Even before and after discussing the Tao with Ju Huang, they had only exchanged words and hadn't really fought. Therefore, he only found out about it now. It turned out that the reason why high-level worlds behaved so normally was because they did not have enough power to activate them. At this moment, he suddenly had an inexplicable thought. Just a little bit of power has caused this world to change. If I use some truly powerful means to completely activate this entire world and release all of its potential, what will the result be? With this in mind, he suddenly felt a little eager to try. At this moment, the innate spirit light condensed by Light Sovereign turned into a long river and condensed in the void. Then, a hand reached out from the long river and grabbed the cultivation technique. Although this palm was similar in nature to the palm formed by the spirit light from before, due to the difference in structure, there was a world of difference. Previously, when the palm of spirit light reached into the innate inextinguishable spirit light, the essence of the innate inextinguishable spirit light was almost instantly expelled by the tiny innate inextinguishable spirit light, causing the innate inextinguishable spirit light to lose any power to protect it. Even the spirit light was directly shattered and erased. However, at this moment, the palm formed by the innate inextinguishable spirit light forcibly reached into the innate inextinguishable spirit light, forcibly breaking through the layers of obstacles and grabbing at the cultivation technique of Luo Fan's flesh and blood body. This process was very difficult and very slow. However, compared to before, it was already a lot better. At least, it did not shatter the moment it entered the innate inextinguishable spirit light. Seeing this, Luo Fan put away the various thoughts in his mind and focused his gaze on the tiny innate inextinguishable spirit light. Of course, he only looked at it. At this moment, he did not make any movements, not even his thoughts to control the tiny innate inextinguishable spirit light. Can I block it or not? This thought flashed through his mind. Chapter 1690. P.S. Read the exclusive story behind Extraordinary Primitive Times and listen to your suggestions for the novel. Follow the official account, WeChat, add friends, add the official account, type DD, and tell me secretly. At this moment, the tiny innate inextinguishable spirit light suddenly flickered violently. Less than or equal to top, less than or equal to dot, less than or equal to small, less than or equal to say. As it flickered, the innate inextinguishable spirit light changed subtly every time, as if it was about to condense into something indescribable. Amidst these changes, the palm formed by the simulated innate inextinguishable spirit light began to collapse. Bits and pieces of the simulated innate inextinguishable spirit light scattered in all directions. Facing this change, the Light Emperor, who had been refined by the innate inextinguishable spirit light, took action. He raised his hand and pointed at the river of simulated innate inextinguishable spirit light. Waves surged on the long river, and countless simulated innate inextinguishable spirit light began to pour into the palm formed by the simulated innate inextinguishable spirit light, frantically increasing the power of the palm. During this process, the palm began to gradually recover. This recovery and the collapse of the tiny innate inextinguishable spirit light formed a cycle, causing the palm to continuously collapse and recover at the same time. It was like a seesaw. At this moment, the tiny innate inextinguishable spirit light grew larger and more obvious. The outline of a strange, unknown object began to gradually appear on the tiny innate inextinguishable spirit light. This is going to condense into a primal origin spiritual treasure? A bolt of lightning suddenly flashed in Luo Fan's mind, and an unbelievable idea was born in his mind. That's impossible. After that thought, he quickly had another idea. The innate inextinguishable spirit light had two uses, at least for cultivators. That was the case. First, it could be integrated into one's original life source. As a result, one's original life source could become an eternal and indestructible supreme existence, becoming a true sage in a certain form. Second, it could evolve naturally. Or it could be promoted through various other methods, and finally turn into a real, undiminished primal origin spiritual treasure. However, no matter which of these two uses, it would be extremely difficult to achieve. If one wanted to refine the innate inextinguishable spirit light, it could only be done when the innate inextinguishable spirit light was still in its original state. However, even in its primitive state, it would take a lot of effort to fuse it with the origin of life. One would need to absorb it into one's life essence and nurture it for countless trillions of years. The time required was even longer than cultivating from zero to becoming a true sage. And in order for this connate inextinguishable spirit light to evolve into a primordial origin spirit treasure, it was necessary. Time was also extremely long. Moreover, once it evolved, it would inevitably become a true primordial essence spirit treasure. The only exception would be if it was nourished during the evolution process, constantly incorporating his own mark into it. Only then would it be possible for it to become a cultivator's magic treasure after its final evolution. Otherwise, only a true saint would be able to refine a primordial origin spirit treasure that had evolved. These two uses were clearly impossible for the connate inextinguishable spiritual light before him. That was because the innate inextinguishable spiritual light had already started to evolve. It had now become a group of worlds formed by countless worlds. Its will was already strong enough to repel everything. At most, it could only be refined in such a way, turning it into a different form of magic treasure. Even so, Luo Fan's conjecture still needed to be correct in order to achieve that. It was precisely because of this reason that Luo Fan had never wanted to fuse the connate inextinguishable spiritual light with his origin of life or evolve it into a true primordial origin spirit treasure. He planned to. However, at this moment, the development of the matter was somewhat beyond his expectations. At this moment, the tiny connate inextinguishable spiritual light that he had split out actually showed faint signs of condensing into a primordial origin spirit treasure. Although it was only wisps and wisps, the condensed form was also extremely illusory and unstable. However, there were signs after all, turning something that was originally impossible into a possibility. For Luo Fan, it was easy to imagine how pleasantly surprised it was. Looks like the stimulation wasn't enough. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan did not hesitate to summon the remaining 7 supreme emperors who had been refined by the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. These 7 supreme emperors were originally walking around like Emperor Ming, feeling the wonderful state of mind after being refined by the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. When they suddenly received Luo Fan's order, they could not help but be astonished. However, as mentioned before, Luo Fan was now the embodiment of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light in their eyes. They naturally did not dare to disobey his orders. Immediately, these 7 supreme emperors traversed through time and space, arriving in front of Luo Fan in the blink of an eye, standing beside Emperor Ming. You all should also seize this cultivation method like Emperor Ming did, Luo Fan ordered calmly. Seize the cultivation method? The supreme emperors were shocked. As the simulated connate inextinguishable spiritual light poured into the long river suddenly expanded by more than 7 times. Moreover, due to the different simulations stimulating and complementing each other, the light on the simulated connate inextinguishable spiritual light became purer and more similar to the real connate inextinguishable spiritual light. This was actually equivalent to a form of Tao discussion. These simulated connate inextinguishable spiritual lights were the manifestation of the 8 supreme emperors' understanding of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. These simulations were different because of the different cultivation methods of each person. There were also various differences between the simulations. There were even conflict, and when these differences and conflicts were combined, they naturally had a deeper understanding of the characteristics of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. As a result, all of their simulations of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light became more and more similar to the real connate inextinguishable spiritual light. As the simulated connate inextinguishable spiritual light grew stronger and stronger, the small connate inextinguishable spiritual light that Luo Fan had condensed became more and more intense. The countless worlds within the connate inextinguishable spiritual light began to gradually collapse and turn into pure spiritual light. Along with this change, the outline of the object condensed from the connate inextinguishable spiritual light also became more and more real, more and more clear. Finally, it appeared in front of Luo Fan. Finally, it truly appeared in front of Luo Fan. Finally, it appeared in front of Luo Fan. It was a mirror that had yet to be determined. It was constantly fluctuating as if it could collapse and disappear at any time, but it also seemed like it could condense into a solid mirror at any time. And at this time, the palm formed from the simulated connate inextinguishable spiritual light pressed on the mirror. It wanted to reach into the mirror and grab the cultivation method that existed in the depths of the mirror. At the point of contact between the two, a strong impact was constantly released. It constantly shook the surrounding world and affected the great Tao of this world. It caused the great Tao of this world to continuously release light and fluctuations during this process, causing the entire world to begin to continuously increase in level. It allowed the cultivators in this world to clearly sense that the world had become more and more vast and profound. It allowed the false saints in that world to feel that they had already reached their limit. It seemed like there was still a huge space for them to improve, to the false saints of this world. They were originally already standing at the peak of this world. All the principles and mysteries in this world were like looking at the lines on their palms to them. At least, they felt that it was as clear as looking at the lines on their palms. It was as clear as looking at the lines on their palms. It was precisely because of this. Before this, even if they wanted to continue to improve and cultivate, they couldn't find a way or direction at all. But, at this time, the situation was different. At this time, they all felt that the world in front of them, which was originally under their control, had already broken away from their control. What they had originally comprehended and thought that they had already comprehended the mysteries of this world suddenly became so insignificant, as if they had only occupied a 10,000th of this world. This naturally allowed them to feel the existence of the space for improvement and the direction to move forward. It was a pity that this feeling couldn't last long for these false saints. Once the conflict at Luo Fan's location disappeared, the world would return to its original state. Most of the mysteries and potential of the great Tao would go back to sleep, as if they didn't exist. They wouldn't be able to detect them at all. And to these false saints, This was obviously a disaster that would make it impossible for them to advance anymore. Even if the false saints weren't as good as the supreme emperors, they wouldn't be idiots. The strength of his intelligence and deduction ability was naturally self-evident. At this time, all kinds of thoughts flashed through the minds of the false saints, but they vaguely guessed that the current changes might not last long. They guessed that the space and direction they could sense would very likely disappear without a trace very soon. However, under such circumstances, none of them began to cultivate immediately. Instead, they began to try hard to remember this feeling. They tried hard to remember the direction of their cultivation so that they could continue to cultivate according to their memories and progress according to their memories after the world returned to its original state. Even though it would be extremely difficult for them to improve their cultivation if they did that, it would be extremely shocking. But compared to not being able to find the direction at all, it was still countless times better. Under such circumstances, how would these false saints have the time and energy to find the source of the changes? It was also because of this that Luo Fan was currently experimenting in the void somewhere in this world, but no false saints came to disturb him. Even their spying gazes or senses didn't sweep past this place. Although Luo Fan didn't divert much attention to observe all these changes, just by sensing the changes in this world, he had already instinctively deduced all sorts of things. At this moment, he wasn't surprised at all. At this moment, his eyes were more focused on the primordial origin spiritual treasure that was taking shape. The simulated innate indestructible spiritual light that Emperor Ming and the other 7 had released continuously exerted force at this moment. Its power began to increase rapidly, causing the palm to perform better and better as it collided with the tiny innate indestructible spiritual light. In the beginning, the palm that was condensed from the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light continued to shatter, and countless tiny fragments flew everywhere. However, as time passed, those fragments became fewer and fewer. The damage suffered by the palm also became smaller and smaller. In the end, even all the fragments stopped splattering. Instead, there were only traces of cracks appearing on the palm, causing wounds to appear on the palm. Moreover, the scars on his body were continuously decreasing. If he were to deduce in this direction, the palm might really be able to break through the defense of the innate indestructible spiritual light in the end, reach into the mirror outline, and grab the cultivation technique. Facing such a scene, Luo Fan wasn't worried at all. On the contrary, the anticipation in his eyes grew. Of course, it wasn't because he enjoyed the feeling of being abused, but because he clearly knew that the potential of the innate indestructible spiritual light was limitless. The more pressure there was, the more potential the innate indestructible spiritual light could release. If the palm could really break through the innate indestructible spiritual light, the innate indestructible spiritual light would definitely release incredible power. In the end, it might even directly condense into a magic treasure, and there was even a possibility that this mirror-like primordial origin spiritual treasure would completely take shape. How could he not be looking forward to this? Sure enough, it was just as Luo Fan had thought. As the pressure from the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light increased, the tiny innate indestructible spiritual light really underwent a great change. The originally constantly changing silhouette began to gradually stabilize. That blurry silhouette, the blurry figure also gradually became clearer. This change caused its power to continuously increase. The pressure on the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light also continued to increase, and this instead caused the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light to continuously increase in power, causing the power of the palm formed by the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light to continuously increase, causing the pressure on the tiny innate indestructible spiritual light to increase again. This formed a kind of virtuous cycle, causing the power of both sides to continuously increase. The final result of this was that the two sides formed a stalemate. And in this world, However, as it became more and more profound, the great Tao of this world released more and more dazzling brilliance, causing those false sages to feel pain and happiness at the same time. There was no limit to the improvement of the innate indestructible spiritual light. However, there was a limit to the improvement of the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light. There was also a limit to the improvement of this world. The limit of the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light. This was the limit of the supreme emperors like Emperor Ming. It was the limit of their understanding of the mysteries of the innate indestructible spiritual light. And the limit of this world was the limit of a level 4 world. When the power of the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light reached the limit of the wisdom of the supreme emperors like Emperor Ming, causing them to be unable to understand the mysteries of the innate indestructible spiritual light to strengthen the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light, the power of the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light would reach its limit. And similarly, when the great Tao of this world was raised to the level of a level 4 world, this world would also reach its limit. And once it reached its limit, the palm formed by the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light would be crushed by the power of the infinitely increased innate indestructible spiritual light. And this world would also experience all kinds of destruction because of this. What Luo Fan hoped now was that this world could reach its limit after the simulated innate indestructible spiritual light was raised to its limit. Otherwise, he was afraid that he would have to move to a world that was not the most suitable for his cultivation to carry out this experiment. Time passed slowly. Unknowingly, a year had passed. At a certain moment after a year, cracking sounds suddenly came from all parts of this world. "Oh no, this world has reached its limit!" At this moment, Luo Fan understood what was going on. As his eyes narrowed, he had already discovered that in this world, the first crack had appeared on the great Tao that was originally constantly improving and emitting all kinds of inexplicable light. Endless mysteries were quickly awakening and activating. It was an extremely tiny crack that would almost be missed if one did not have outstanding eyesight. Although this crack was small, its appearance represented a fact that Luo Fan did not want to see, and that was that this world could no longer withstand his experiment here. At this moment, cracking sounds rang in the ears of the countless living beings everywhere in this world. The crack of the great Tao was the foundation of their existence for the many living beings in this world. The crack was the source of their existence. The crack was the source of their existence. This would naturally appear in their ears. At the same time, the hearts of the many false saints in this world trembled at this moment. They felt an extremely strong sense of danger from the bottom of their hearts. What's going on? Is this world going to be destroyed? At this moment, such a thought appeared in the minds of these false saints. The destruction of the great Tao would mean the destruction of the world. And the destruction of the world was a disaster for these false saints, who were only false saints in this world. No matter where they went, they would definitely be destroyed along with the destruction of this world. At this stage, how could these false saints dare to continue staying here quietly and memorize the direction of their cultivation method? However, they released their senses one by one to search the world, searching for the source of all the changes. When Luo Fan came to this world, although he didn't reveal himself without concealment, because he didn't want to plot anything here, he didn't hide himself too much. These false saints were the false saints of this world. Their ability to sense this world had reached an indescribable level. After a crazy search, they finally found some traces that Luo Fan had leaked out. He had actually locked onto Luo Fan's location with his weak body. At this moment, the fake saints quickly rushed over from various cave abodes, wanting to see for themselves what exactly was happening here. As they sensed and moved, the cracking sounds coming from the great path continued to ring out. The cracks on the great Tao also continued to increase and expand, at the moment when the false saints were about to arrive. An incomparably strange feeling swept over them. At this moment, the sense of danger that filled their hearts suddenly disappeared. The cracking sounds that came from the great Tao and were heard by countless living beings and cultivators in this world also disappeared. At the same time, the great Tao, it began to heal rapidly and dim. Almost at the moment when the false saints reacted, everything returned to before the changes, when the false saints could not sense the direction of their advance at all and could not sense the room for improvement. The changes have stopped? All the false saints felt lost at this moment. At the same time, there was an indescribable frustration gradually brewing in their hearts, making them wish that they could destroy the entire world. If they had not sensed that there was still room for improvement and the direction to continue improving, they would still be able to enjoy this extreme and peak state. However, after sensing that state, they had to get rid of that state and once again fall into a state where they could no longer advance or cultivate. To them, this was as painful as stuffing a whale in the ocean into a tiny pond. Fortunately, these false saints were existences with great wisdom after all. Although this frustration was brewing, it was quickly eliminated by them, preventing them from putting this destructive desire into reality. What a pity! An inexplicable sigh came from the mouths of these false saints. In the end, they could only shake their heads, turn around, and return to their cave abodes, returning to their original cultivation places. From then on, this world fell into a state of no saints for a long time. The number of false saints, who were originally quite large and would receive an edict every once in a while, acted as if they did not exist. They hid themselves and no longer cared about the affairs of the world. The reason for this was self-explanatory. They were trying their best to dig out their room for improvement and find a direction for improvement based on their previous memories. After all, this was a level 4 world. Even though many mysteries were hidden in the great Tao and had not been activated or revealed, this would not change the nature of a level 4 world. Chapter 1691. Just as the pseudo-sages once again fell into a state where they could no longer advance, Luo Fan had already moved to another place with Emperor Ming and the others. Or rather, he was in another world. Although the quality of the level 4 world was extremely high, it still couldn't withstand the potential stimulation of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Previously, when the world couldn't withstand it and even the great Tao in it began to crack and was about to collapse, the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and the innate inextinguishable spiritual light had yet to reach their peak. Both of them still had great potential that hadn't been unleashed. In such a situation, Luo Fan clearly knew that if he continued to stay in the level 4 world, what awaited him would be Emperor Ming, and the other supreme emperors would no longer listen to his orders. They would no longer continue to attack the tiny innate inextinguishable spiritual light and would no longer continue to help the innate inextinguishable spiritual light evolve into a true primordial origin spiritual treasure. The reason was very simple. Although these supreme emperors treated Luo Fan as the incarnation of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, they only treated him as an incarnation and didn't really treat him as the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. To them, the innate inextinguishable spiritual light was still the collection of countless worlds. In other words, compared to Luo Fan's orders, it was more important for them to protect the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, or rather, to protect the world inside the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. In this way, if Luo Fan's orders didn't threaten the world inside the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, such as when the power of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and the innate inextinguishable spiritual light had yet to reach the limit that the world could withstand, Emperor Ming and the others would naturally carry out Luo Fan's orders without any hesitation. However, if Luo Fan's orders were to carry out, it would cause damage to the world inside the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. The outcome would be different. At that time, they would definitely fall out with each other. Perhaps they wouldn't directly attack Luo Fan, but they definitely wouldn't continue to help the wicked. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan directly used his control authority over the innate inextinguishable spiritual light to transfer them and the cultivation technique to the level 9 world when the level 4 world couldn't withstand it. The level 4 world couldn't withstand the power increase of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, but the level 9 world definitely wouldn't have a problem. To a certain extent, a 9th level world could already be called a perfect world. Even a true saint would find it extremely difficult to destroy such a world, much less this tiny bit of inextinguishable Xiantian spirit light evolving into a primordial essence spirit treasure. Sure enough, when they moved to the level 9 world, the strong impact only caused the world to tremble slightly. It made the great Tao of the world become slightly brighter. But it didn't cause any obvious damage to the world, let alone the existence of cracks or anything like that. It was also because of the transfer that Emperor Ming and the others, who were originally a little restless, finally stopped their actions and continued to attack the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, or rather, the mirror-like chaotic origin spiritual treasure, which had a clear outline. They wanted to reach into it and grab what was inside. The cultivation technique of Luo Fan's flesh and blood body. After coming to this world, this cultivation technique could no longer be continued, just like in the level 4 world. It constantly extracted the mysteries from it and integrated them into it to cultivate and sublimate itself. After all, the level of this world was much higher compared to this cultivation method. Even if there were any profound mysteries that leaked out, it would not be enough. Even if the mysteries that leaked out were at a level that was completely incomprehensible, if Luo Fan wanted to make the greatest improvement in this cultivation technique, he obviously wouldn't choose this world. But obviously, at this time, the most important thing for Luo Fan wasn't this, but the chaotic origin spiritual treasure. And so on and so forth. Another 3 years passed. After 3 years, the simulated innate inextinguishable spiritual light that Emperor Ming and the others had condensed was no longer divided into a long river and a palm. All the simulated innate inextinguishable spiritual light had been completely condensed into a palm and pressed on a mirror. This mirror was in the shape of a bronze mirror, and it looked extremely ordinary and simple. However, there was an indescribable, eternal, and indestructible quality emanating from it, vaguely distorting the surrounding space-time dimensions in a subtle way, causing the space-time dimensions around the mirror to show more and more independence in the process. This was obviously a quality that only the chaotic origin spiritual treasure had. For such a characteristic to appear on the mirror, it was self-evident what it meant. Seems like this is already the limit. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed helplessly. At this moment, the scene in front of him still looked so grand and vast. In fact, the level 9 world was already very different from before because of the collision between the two. Whether it was the brightness of the great Tao, the complexity of the nomological laws in the world, or the strengthening of the world that the fake sage of this world felt, it was a world of difference from before. However, this did not change the fact that the chaotic origin spiritual treasure that was forming on this side had already fallen into a stagnation and had not made any progress for a long time, and this change represented one thing. The power of the simulated innate inextinguishable spiritual light could no longer stimulate the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Upon discovering this, Luo Fan sighed. With a thought was transmitted to the hearts of Emperor Ming and the others in front of him. This thought contained an endless amount of information and principles. This information, this logic, was none other than what Luo Fan had comprehended from the natural inextinguishable spirit light, the mysteries of the natural inextinguishable spirit light. These countless mysteries were even more profound than the mysteries that Emperor Ming and the others had received from the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. They were closer to the origin of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Similarly, they also contained more of Luo Fan's imprints. If such mysteries were used to directly increase one's cultivation realm, it would naturally be destroying one's future. However, at this time, it was used to nurture the simulated innate inextinguishable spiritual light of Emperor Ming and the others. This would allow their attacks to become more powerful and thus stimulate the potential of the chaotic origin spiritual treasure that was forming and allow it to form as much as possible. This was really convenient. As Luo Fan's thoughts surged in, Emperor Ming and the others showed various signs of understanding in their eyes. In the blink of an eye, the aura they exuded was subtly different from before. Vaguely, it was starting to move in the direction of Luo Fan. This was like the change that happened to Child Emperor in the world outside the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. The reason why Child Emperor had such a change was because he was actively imitating Luo Fan and learning from Luo Fan. As for Emperor Ming and the others, they were passively enduring Luo Fan's will. They were passively influenced by this will and thus moved in the direction of Luo Fan, just as such a change was happening to their bodies. The power of the simulated innate inextinguishable spiritual light that they had formed also started to gradually increase. It was already so powerful that it could shake time and space. The simulated innate inextinguishable spiritual light that was faintly isolating the surrounding space-time dimension from the other space-time dimensions. As it grew stronger, the eternal and inextinguishable charm that it exuded became stronger and stronger. Even the space-time dimension that was originally only faintly showing signs of being isolated. It was gradually evolving in the direction of being completely isolated. As such a change occurred, the palm formed by the simulated innate inextinguishable spiritual light's impact on the mirror began to gradually increase. As the impact increased, the mirror seemed to be like pig iron that was being tempered, producing an indescribable vibration. In the midst of the vibration, the mirror began to change slightly in the direction of solidification. Seeing this scene, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. "Looks like it's a success," he thought. That mirror had already begun to possess the profoundness of a primordial spiritual treasure. At least, at this moment, any pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure that he had encountered before was as inferior as sewage in a sewer compared to this mirror. Not to mention anything else, just by carefully sensing the entire evolution process, Luo Fan already felt that his horizons had been broadened. He felt that he had gained many new insights into the way of true sage, his own worldview, and the various evolutions of primordial spiritual treasures. He faintly felt that a door that was getting wider and wider was being opened in front of him. Although this process didn't directly affect his cultivation realm, it was still the same as before. However, compared to the improvement of his cultivation method, it had a different kind of magical effect. It also moved him and made him feel happy. Just like that, another 3 years passed. On this day, the mirror that was enduring the constant impact of the palm formed by the simulated innate inextinguishable spiritual light slightly trembled, and suddenly produced an indescribable power that swept over the simulated inextinguishable spiritual light. As this power swept out, the simulated connate inextinguishable spirit light instantly collapsed. All the worlds within it were completely destroyed, and all the spiritual light splashed in all directions, gradually fusing into the surrounding space-time, gradually becoming a part of this world, becoming nutrients for this world to improve. It's done. Such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind in an instant. At this moment, he clearly felt that the mirror evolved from the inextinguishable spiritual light in front of him was no longer illusory at all. The entire mirror had completely turned into reality, becoming a real, complete primordial spiritual treasure. At this moment, this mirror began to emit some kind of indescribable light in front of him. An unprecedentedly strong, eternal, and inextinguishable aura was released from the mirror, quickly surging in all directions, and the surrounding space-time was wrapped in this aura. Luo Fan immediately immersed himself in this aura. then Emperor Ming and the others, then it was the entire world of the 9th rank. In this incomparably mysterious aura, Luo Fan felt an indescribable feeling wrap around him. This feeling was as if he had never been so close to the path of true sage. He was very close to being truly eternal and inextinguishable. There was only a small step left, and all that was left was a wish of his own. Is this the feeling of controlling a primordial spiritual treasure? Such a thought gradually surfaced in Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he slowly opened his eyes. At a glance, he discovered this entire in the level 9 world, all living beings, including Emperor Ming and the others who were not far from Luo Fan, were shocked. One by one, they knelt down in front of the mirror and worshipped it. With a thought, Luo Fan already knew what was going on. The essence of this mirror was too high, so high that it surpassed the dreams of all living beings and the goals of all living beings. It appeared here. The essence of its existence naturally exerted an indescribable pressure on the life source of all living beings, causing them to have no choice but to offer their utmost respect. With a gentle wave of his hand, the mirror gradually shrunk and landed in his hand. As soon as the mirror touched his hand, an unimaginably heavy feeling came over him. In a trance, he felt as if he was holding billions of worlds. Under that heavy pressure, his body even made crackling sounds. It was as if his body could not withstand the weight of this mirror, and was gradually collapsing under the pressure of this mirror. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan's heart moved, and he communicated with the brand contained in the mirror that belonged to him. As he communicated with the brand, he felt as if his flesh and blood were connected. In the blink of an eye, the heavy feeling on the mirror disappeared without a trace. When he held it in his hand, it felt as if there was nothing there. Following this change, the endless aura emanating from the mirror had already been completely withdrawn. This mirror directly changed from its previous supreme state to an ordinary and worn-out bronze mirror. As the aura of the mirror was restrained, all living beings naturally felt their bodies become lighter. Immediately after, he felt a sense of loss. It appeared in the hearts of all living beings. Everything that had happened previously, the aura emitted by this bronze mirror, the act of them kneeling down, was completely erased from their minds, as if it had never happened. Even Emperor Ming and the others were at a loss at this moment. They had completely forgotten everything that had happened after the mirror was completely formed. Looking at their behavior, Luo Fan had an inexplicable understanding in his heart. This is the true appearance of a primordial spirit treasure. Even if someone at a lower boundary knew of the mysteries of this primordial spirit treasure, they would still be unable to retain their memories. All memories related to its mysteries would naturally fade away. This is the true self-concealment of a divine object. He caressed the bronze mirror in his hand, feeling the supreme power hidden within it. Looking at its ordinary form, he seemed to understand something, but also seemed to understand nothing at the same time. We are not strong enough, so we cannot obtain this cultivation method. Please forgive us, fellow Taoists, Emperor Ming said to Luo Fan. The others also said similar words. This was obviously in response to Luo Fan's instructions a few years ago when he asked for their help. Hearing this, Luo Fan came back to his senses. He smiled and said, "Thank you for your help. It's fine now. Fellow Taoists, please do as you please." Hearing this, the Supreme Emperors nodded, lifted their feet, and took a step forward. Their figures directly left this level 9 world, disappearing in front of Luo Fan in the blink of an eye. This level 9 world was not suitable for Luo Fan's cultivation, so it was naturally not suitable for them either. Perhaps they did not understand the division of levels in this world, but with the cultivation instincts of the Supreme Emperors, it was not a problem for them to discover this. In this level 9 world, after the mirror in Luo Fan's hand had completely returned to its normal state, the enhancement caused by the previous impact had gradually weakened. The great Tao of this world gradually returned to its original bleak state. The rules of the world also gradually began to return to their original simplicity. Countless false sages in this world also fell into a state where they could not sense the space to move forward and the direction of cultivation. However, this did not completely cut off their path of cultivation. Since the false sages in the level 4 world could understand early memory, how could they not? After Emperor Ming and the others left, Luo Fan did not stay here for too long. He raised his eyes and glanced at this world before turning around. With a light step, his figure had already stepped out of this world in the blink of an eye, directly arriving in the void between the countless worlds in the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. After arriving here, he looked outside and the power in his body surged. It began to brew. After a few days, when he felt that the power in his body had brewed to a power that was tens of thousands of times stronger than his original normal power, he let out a soft shout and turned this incomparably terrifying power into a pushing force, pushing his body out. He was heading out towards nothing else but the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. In the beginning, before he came into contact with the boundary between the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and the outside world, this process was extremely simple. His figure moved forward hundreds of millions of times faster than lightning. However, the moment he came into contact with the boundary, an existence that he had expected to appeared. A powerful resistance appeared in front of him, blocking his path forward. It made him feel that with every step he took, he had to expend a power that was tens or hundreds of times more than his original strength. Moreover, as he moved forward, this resistance was increasing crazily. He had only taken 3 small steps, and his body had only been able to break away from the innate inextinguishable spirit light by a tiny bit. He felt that the resistance was so strong that even if he brewed for millions of years and condensed hundreds of millions of times his strength, he still wouldn't be able to break through. Bang! A circle of ripples appeared on the surface of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and began to spread rapidly in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already swept across the entire connate inextinguishable spiritual light and kept reverberating on the surface of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. It only disappeared after a while. At this moment, Luo Fan's body seemed to have been bounced back by a huge spring. He was bounced back from the barrier between the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and the outside world, crashing into the level 9 world at a speed hundreds of millions of times faster than lightning. Boom, boom, boom! The world shook violently. The great Tao of the entire world erupted with an incomparably shocking brightness at this moment. It did not look like a great Tao at all. Instead, it looked like a sun that was releasing endless light and heat. And at this moment, in the level 9 world, those false sages suddenly felt the feeling of being able to clearly feel the space before them and the direction of their cultivation return. However, the relaxed feeling that he had felt previously did not appear. Instead, it was replaced by a feeling of impending disaster. It was as if something extremely bad and had a huge negative impact on them was about to happen. At this moment, the entire world was shrouded in light. Under this light, everything in the world seemed to freeze. Be it false sages, ordinary cultivators, or ordinary elderly people, waterfalls, fallen leaves, or breezes, they were all completely frozen in this light. As they froze, cracks began to spread and gradually enveloped the entire world, causing the world to seem like it was about to shatter like a mirror. At this moment, an indescribable power was emitted. This power could not be described with words. After it appeared, with a slight sweep, it had already healed all the cracks that filled the entire world. After the cracks were healed, the light slowly converged. Not long after, the thin face became the outline of a human holding a mirror in the center of this world. Then, the mirror trembled slightly. All the light converged, and the outline of the figure was revealed. Obviously, he was Luo Fan. Only Luo Fan could cause such a terrifying scene, almost destroying this level 9 world. Compared to before, he was now in a somewhat sorry state. His face was pale, and there was an inexplicable lingering fear in his eyes. The power around him was also slightly chaotic. If it wasn't for the mirror suppressing everything, he might have already been torn apart by the chaotic energy and turned into dust, disappearing without a trace. This doppelganger was almost finished, Luo Fan muttered. Chapter 1692. What he wanted to do before was nothing else but to take this primordial essence spirit treasure that he had spent a great deal of time and effort to evolve and bring it out of the inextinguishable natural light. He wanted to make it his own, a primordial essence spirit treasure that would allow him to truly be everlasting and indestructible, a primordial essence spirit treasure that couldn't be worn down by 10,000 tribulations. However, it was obvious that everything that had happened just now had told him that he was just a lunatic talking nonsense. This primordial spiritual treasure was indeed a real primordial spiritual treasure, and its power inside the connate inextinguishable spirit light was not much different from a real primordial spiritual treasure. However, it was only formed from a tiny wisp of the innate spiritual light. A normal primordial spiritual treasure needed a complete connate inextinguishable spirit light to evolve into a real primordial spiritual treasure. Moreover, this process would take billions of years to complete. This primordial spiritual treasure was evolved from a tiny wisp of connate inextinguishable spirit light, and it only took a few years from the beginning to the end. Even with the stimulation of Emperor Ming and the others, the time was too short. No matter how he looked at it, it was different from a real primordial spiritual treasure, right? Before this, Luo Fan had a vague guess about this difference. But it was only now that he was really sure of his guess. This primordial spiritual treasure was indeed a real primordial spiritual treasure, but it could not leave the connate inextinguishable spirit light. Before this, he was still a little confused about the reason behind this. But when the final result came out, he felt that his thoughts were clear. It turned out that he had some doubts and some vague understanding. At this time, it had become incomparably clear. And this also made him understand that he, in fact, had not completely eliminated his wishful thinking. Why was there such a difference in understanding before and after? The reason was that before this, he still had a wishful thinking in his heart. His thoughts were not willing to admit the possibility that it was disadvantageous to him, and he instinctively did not want to think deeply about it, which led to this situation. The reason why this primordial spiritual treasure could not leave the connate inextinguishable spirit light. The reason was very simple. It was a part of the complete connate inextinguishable spirit light. How could it change inside the connate inextinguishable spirit light? No matter how it changed, it was just like a social change in a certain world inside the connate inextinguishable spirit light. But if he wanted to take this primordial spiritual treasure out of the connate inextinguishable spirit light, the situation would be completely different. It was equivalent to cutting off a part of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and bringing it out. It was equivalent to destroying the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. However, to destroy this innate inextinguishable spiritual light, even in the state of chaos, how could Luo Fan do it? He even suspected that it would not be easy for a true sage to achieve this. Thinking about all of this, Luo Fan could not help but smile bitterly, secretly feeling embarrassed for his previous behavior. At the same time, he reflected on himself. In his heart, he warned himself to pay attention to that kind of fluke mentality. It was impossible for the primordial origin spirit treasure to leave the natural inextinguishable spirit light. In fact, this fact was true even for mortals. As long as he thought about it a little more, he would be able to figure it out. However, he, as a supreme emperor who had already found the way to become a saint, had actually been deceived. How could he not think of this? Was this not worthy of his vigilance? There were all sorts of thoughts in his mind. Luo Fan's expression gradually changed inexplicably. The complacency that had been born from obtaining the primordial essence, spirit treasure, had already disappeared. Instead, it was replaced with a more steady and calm demeanor. Although I can't bring it out, it's still a primordial origin spirit treasure. Even if it can only be used in this world group, it's still a great gain. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan gradually dispersed the power that had accumulated in his body beyond what his body could withstand, allowing his body to return to its normal peak state. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a light stride. His figure had already left the level 9 world. This world had almost been shattered by the rebounding power, but under Luo Fan's control, the power of the entire inextinguishable spiritual light continued to gather in this world, quickly eliminating the damage that this world had suffered in an extremely mysterious manner, allowing this world to completely recover. Therefore, at this moment, this level 9 world was in an absolutely perfect state. There was no damage inside or outside. In fact, because of the terrifying impact from before, some of the potential of this world had been stimulated, causing this world to look more advanced than before. The great Tao in the dark had become much brighter. After leaving this world, Luo Fan's heart moved and he arrived at a level 4 world. In the blink of an eye, he had already entered it. After entering this world, the mirror-like primordial origin spirit treasure shook slightly, and there was a faint, inexplicable pressure leaking out, causing the entire level 4 world to tremble subtly. Under this trembling, the potential of this world seemed to explode uncontrollably. The great Tao in the dark started to flicker with an inexplicable light, and the rules and laws of this world became more and more complicated during this process. At the same time, the false saints in this world all felt the sudden appearance of a huge space for improvement that they had not seen for a long time. The reason for this change was very simple. It was because the existence of this primordial origin spirit treasure had already surpassed the limit that this level 4 world could withstand. At this moment, just the existence of this primordial origin spirit treasure had already caused this world to begin to stimulate all the hidden potential due to the immense pressure. It could be imagined that if this continued, when the potential of this world was completely unleashed, it would be the time for this world to completely collapse. So that's how it is. Luo Fan looked at this scene with a vexed expression. Before this primordial origin spirit treasure had existed in the level 9 world. There, although this primordial origin spirit treasure had brought great pressure to that world in the beginning, it had restrained the power of this primordial origin spirit treasure. This kind of pressure naturally dissipated. However, he did not expect that in this level 4 world, even restraining the power of this primordial origin spirit treasure would not be able to completely eliminate the pressure it exerted on the outside world. Just the essence of its existence was already about to cause this world to collapse. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could only sigh and take a step forward. He directly left this level 4 world. As he stepped out of the level 4 world with the primordial origin spirit treasure, that world quickly recovered. Whether it was the great Tao or the rules of that world, or everything else, everything was the same. In the blink of an eye, that level 4 world was already the same as before the primordial origin spirit treasure had entered. Originally, Luo Fan wanted to use this primordial essence spirit treasure to wrap his own flesh and blood body in his cultivation method. He wanted to let his body naturally extract endless mysteries from the level 4 world, evolve and sublimate on its own. But now this world could not even support its existence, so it was obviously impossible to do this. All kinds of thoughts flashed in his mind. He played with the incomparably mysterious primordial origin spirit treasure that could even destroy a level 4 world in its existence form. Suddenly, an idea flashed in his mind. In an instant, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. Then, he casually waved the primordial origin spirit treasure in his hand. A phantom of a mirror. It gradually separated from the primordial origin spirit treasure like a mirror splitting. This mirror phantom seemed illusory and real, but it exuded an eternal and indestructible aura. Appearing in the void, it naturally formed an incomparably mysterious illusory world, forming a circle of incomparably mysterious, specific space-time dimensions. This phantom was the projection of the primordial origin spirit treasure. The primordial origin spirit treasure, to a certain extent, it was already equivalent to a true sage. This kind of existence could create billions of projections. That was just ordinary. Now, he had only created one. What was the big deal? Although this projection was just a projection, it already contained a part of the characteristics of the primordial origin spirit treasure. Compared to any pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure, it was countless times stronger. It could be said that just the projection alone was already invincible in the realm of true sage. In this projection, Luo Fan's fleshly body was quietly curled up. It looked like a ball of strange thread made of unknown material. After the projection of the primordial origin spirit treasure appeared, it shook slightly, and all the light and aura were completely restrained. As its aura was restrained, the world phantom that had originally formed because of the projection naturally disappeared, allowing the void around Luo Fan to return to its original appearance. Then, the mirror phantom slightly shook, rushed forward, and directly rushed into the fourth-level world. As it rushed in, the fourth-level world shook slightly. The Great Way began to shine, and the rules and principles began to rapidly evolve in a complicated direction. It was not much different from when the main body of the primordial origin spirit treasure had entered. However, this was only the beginning. Soon, the changes stopped. The fourth-level world thus maintained a state where part of its potential had been stimulated and stopped changing. Sure enough, although there is pressure, it is not as great as when I used the main body of the primordial origin spirit treasure. It is still within the range that the fourth-level world can bear. Such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he had an idea and summoned Emperor Ming and the others. Previously, he had planned to use the primordial origin spirit treasure to protect the cultivation method of the flesh and blood body. However, the power of the primordial origin spirit treasure was too strong, and the world could not bear it. Naturally, this plan could not be carried out, and this resulted in a result. That was, all his previous plans and experiments were in vain. Now that he had used the projection of the primordial origin spirit treasure to protect the cultivation method of his flesh and blood body, he naturally had to experiment again. There was nothing much to be said about this experiment. It was nothing more than the previous process, the final result of the experiment. But it made Luo Fan heave a sigh of relief. Even if Emperor Ming and the others attacked with all their strength, they would not be able to exceed the limit of the fourth-level world and destroy it. The projection of the primordial origin spirit treasure did not move at all, and was not affected by their attacks. No matter how the attacks poured on it, there was no change. It felt like he was holding a noodle against a long sword. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan was relieved. He waved his hand and sent Emperor Ming and the others back. After that, he no longer cared about what would happen inside the fourth-level world. He turned around and left the fourth-level world. He came directly to the door that was surrounded by countless lights and shadows, the door that led to the state of chaos. This door that led directly to the state of chaos was no different from before. He could still touch the state of chaos with a stretch of his hand. But, compared to before, the situation was very different. Previously, Luo Fan could clearly feel the terrifying danger it contained. That kind of feeling, as long as he reached out and touched the state of chaos, the power of the state of chaos would suddenly erupt and completely erase his body, and even all traces of his existence would disappear completely. But now, this feeling of danger had completely disappeared. What replaced it was a kind of confidence, a confidence that he would be fine even if he touched the state of chaos. This kind of confidence, it was not without a reason, but it came from the primordial origin spirit treasure that looked like a bronze mirror in his hand. Is this my illusion, or is it real? This thought suddenly appeared in Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, his heart moved, and he slowly reached out towards the state of chaos. As his palms stretched forward, the bronze mirror in his hand began to tremble slightly. An inexplicable power was produced from the bronze mirror and poured into his body, causing his entire body to gradually transform into an incomparably mysterious state. This mysterious state. At first glance, there was no difference from the normal situation. But as long as he carefully sensed it, he would discover. This state was actually a state of fusion. In this state, the relationship between his body and the bronze mirror in his hand seemed to become closer and more intimate. In the end, the instant before his palm touched the state of chaos, the bronze mirror seemed to have completely fused with his body. Although Luo Fan had already reached out to touch the state of chaos when he sensed that incomparably safe feeling, the truth was that he was constantly sensing the state of his body during this process, and was constantly prepared to withdraw his hand and stop his plan. Therefore, he was able to clearly sense the indescribable fusion between his body and the copper mirror during this entire process. Moreover, he was also able to clearly grasp all the changes that were occurring during this process. At this point, he finally understood why he felt so safe. Finally, he no longer had any scruples and forcefully thrust forward, wanting to directly insert his hand into the state of chaos. However, at this moment, an incomparably gentle force suddenly appeared in front of his palm. It blocked the path of his palm. What's going on? Luo Fan frowned. He tried again and raised his hand to press down again, only to find that his palm was still blocked by that gentle force. Moreover, no matter how much strength he used, the force that was blocking his hand didn't lose the slightest bit, nor did it show any signs of breaking through. It was as if there was an invisible barrier between him and the state of chaos. After a few attempts, Luo Fan sighed and could only stop. After thinking about it for a while, he understood what was going on. Now, this primordial origin spiritual treasure had in fact formed a 1-2 relationship with him. Under this kind of relationship, when his palm entered the state of chaos, it was equivalent to the primordial origin spiritual treasure also entering the state of chaos. And from another perspective, didn't this mean that the primordial origin spiritual treasure had left the connate inextinguishable spiritual light? And through previous deductions, it was already determined that it was impossible for the primordial origin spiritual treasure to leave the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Understanding this, Luo Fan shook his head and sighed. He knew that he had made the same mistake as before. After reflecting on himself again, he moved his palm away from the state of chaos. As his palm moved away from the state of chaos, the state of fusing with the primordial essence, spirit treasure, naturally separated itself from it. Shaking his head slightly and sighing, Luo Fan took a light step forward and left the door leading to the state of chaos. Although he still needed to comprehend the state of chaos here to improve his cultivation and perfect his worldview. However, compared to this, he had a more important thing to do. That was to take away this connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Let this connate inextinguishable spiritual light go to where his body was, so that this connate inextinguishable spiritual light would no longer be in a state of ownerlessness. Instead, it would truly be marked with his name. This was like finding a gold mine in the wild. If it was placed there, everyone would think that it was ownerless. Even if someone's name was written on it, no one would think that it belonged to that person because of that name. But if he took this gold mine back and placed it in someone's house, even if his name was not on it, no one would think that the gold mine was not his. And now, this connate inextinguishable spiritual light was the gold mine. Although Luo Fan had not truly refined this connate inextinguishable spiritual light, as long as he could transfer it to where his body was and control it, then no one would be able to deny that this connate inextinguishable spiritual light was his. The acknowledgement of others would not have any effect on Luo Fan's mastery of this connate inextinguishable spiritual light. However, the acknowledgement of others, It could avoid trouble, lest he had to face many supreme emperors appearing inside and outside the connate inextinguishable spiritual light every once in a while, trying to refine it. At this time, Luo Fan was suspended in the void between the many worlds. He did not leave this connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Instead, with a thought, this connate inextinguishable spiritual light shook slightly and began to move slowly. Luo Fan mastered this connate inextinguishable spiritual light. He relied on the resonance between his flesh and blood body and this connate inextinguishable spiritual light, and nothing else. Therefore, if he wanted to move this connate inextinguishable spiritual light, he naturally only needed this resonance. Naturally, he did not need to leave this connate inextinguishable spiritual light. This was different from taking something and leaving the place where the gate of chaos was. The structure of time and space was extremely mysterious, and the connection between it and the outside world was even faintly discernible. This could be seen from the fact that the connection between all supreme emperors and that unknown place had been cut off. Therefore, it was not as easy to move anything here as it was in the outside world. There was no way to easily shift time and space, and one could only move forward by flying. This connate inextinguishable spiritual light was the same. This was even more so when Luo Fan's control of this connate inextinguishable spiritual light had not reached the level where he could truly control it as he pleased. This went on for a full 10 years. This connate inextinguishable spiritual light finally arrived at the edge of the gate of chaos. Only then could he finally sense that indescribable existence that could be sensed anywhere in the world. I'm finally here. At this moment, within the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, Luo Fan let out a long sigh of relief. If he was doing other things, 10 years was of course nothing to him. Not to mention making him feel tired. He probably wouldn't even be able to attract much attention. However, don't forget that what he was doing in these 10 years was indirectly controlling this connate inextinguishable spiritual light. This kind of manipulation required him to perform some kind of extremely subtle and complicated control over his own body. It also required him to fully activate his potential and concentrate on all of this. This point could actually be imagined from the fact that he shrunk the connate inextinguishable spiritual light into the ring that revolved around his body back then. Therefore, during this process, Luo Fan was under great pressure both physically and mentally. In the end, these 10 years felt as long as hundreds of millions of years to him. With this kind of background, now that he had finally arrived at the edge of the gate of chaos and finally sensed that unknown place, he could finally use the method of shifting time and space to directly transfer this connate inextinguishable spiritual light to where his main body was. He no longer needed to fly as painstakingly as before. How could he not relax? Just as Luo Fan let out a sigh of relief and was about to shift time and space to transfer this connate inextinguishable spiritual light to where his main body was, the surrounding time and space distorted. Chapter 1693. This hand was so huge that it even flickered with an eternal and indestructible light. This allowed the hand to remain unaffected even in the dusky primal chaos gate. The grayish existence in the surroundings was like air to him. It constantly attacked the palm, but it couldn't even cause the slightest ripple on the palm. That palm stretched straight towards the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Judging from the looks of it clearly, he wanted to take the innate inextinguishable spiritual light for himself. Who? Luo Fan's heart trembled. His figure flashed and he suddenly appeared outside of the innate spiritual light. With a gentle wave of his hand, countless spiritual lights emerged from his body, condensing into an imitation of the innate spiritual light. It directly turned into a palm and brazenly welcomed the incoming palm. At this moment, the primordial origin spirit treasure that had just been born was naturally not in his hands. Instead, it was inside the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Cent pound top, cent pound point, cent pound little, cent pound say. Therefore, at this time, it was certainly impossible for Luo Fan to use this primordial essence spirit treasure to fight the enemy. He could only fight like he normally did, using his spiritual light to simulate all sorts of things to fight the enemy. His imitation of the innate spirit light was much more similar to the imitation of the innate spirit light that the others had shown before. After it appeared, it naturally possessed a kind of eternal indestructibility. An indomitable charm was revealed. This palm that was formed from the innate inextinguishable spirit light seemed to contain its own unique space-time dimension. Although it was launched later, it slapped onto the approaching palm first. Before the palm could activate its power to its limit, the power of Luo Fan's palm had already been triggered. An earth-shattering quake was produced. At this moment, an incomparably pitch-black cloud appeared out of thin air. Inside the cloud, moreover, he could faintly sense the existence of an inconceivable destructive power. However, the cloud disappeared just as quickly as it appeared. A shock wave that seemed to engulf the entire world was emitted from the point of contact between the two palms, directly sweeping through the cloud. Before the cloud's power could erupt, it was directly dispersed by the shock wave. All the power contained within was instantly crushed, and the shock wave spread out in all directions. At this moment, the palm that Luo Fan had condensed, which simulated the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, suddenly collapsed. All the tiny fragments flew in all directions, as if a huge firework had appeared out of nowhere. Compared to the palm formed by the innate inextinguishable spirit light, the palm that had appeared out of nowhere performed much better. Although it had shattered into countless pieces, it did not completely explode. Instead, it looked as if the countless pores on the palm were spitting out sparks. The result of such a collision was obvious. Luo Fan had fallen into a disadvantageous position. Moreover, it was a huge disadvantage. The palm that had obtained the upper hand and defeated Luo Fan's counterattack passed through the powerful shockwave produced by the collision without hesitation and slapped towards Luo Fan. The opponent's target was obviously the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. However, since Luo Fan was here, it clearly meant that if he wanted to obtain the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, he could only appear and subdue Luo Fan. The light on it is the true innate inextinguishable spiritual light. At this moment, Luo Fan already knew what he was facing. His imitation of the innate spirit light resonated with the innate spirit light. He could feel the essence of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light at all times, so he had almost reached the limit of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Under such circumstances, obviously, only something related to the true innate inextinguishable spiritual light could defeat the simulated innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Coupled with the eternal and inextinguishable light that appeared on the palm at this moment, how could he not know that it was the light of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light? To be able to use the light of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light so easily, to be able to add it to his own attack, the one who launched the attack should at least be a grade 3 emperor. In other words, an emperor with the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Although he didn't know why a grade 3 emperor with the innate inextinguishable spiritual light would attack him, Luo Fan obviously didn't want to sit still and wait for death. At this moment, after figuring out what kind of existence his opponent was, his heart stirred. He raised his hand, and a V-shaped fragment appeared in his hand. After this fragment appeared, it shook slightly and disappeared without a trace. Then, in front of the palm that stretched over, there were hundreds of millions of fragments. Among these hundreds of millions of fragments, every one of them was no different from a real fragment. They also had their own independent space-time dimension. The pressure it exerted on all existences in the outside world was equally terrifying. Even if there was only one such fragment, it was enough to make the palm exhausted. At this time, when hundreds of millions of fragments suddenly appeared at the same time, how could the palm withstand it? A muffled groan came from the void. Then, the palm collapsed under the attack of the hundreds of millions of fragments, turning into countless tiny fragments that splashed in all directions. It seemed that in the blink of an eye, it had turned into a huge firework. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan just casually withdrew his hand, and the hundreds of millions of fragments suddenly disappeared. In the blink of an eye, they directly reappeared in his hand, worthy of being a fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure. An inexplicable satisfaction arose in Luo Fan's heart. After this satisfaction, there was a kind of indescribable unwillingness that emerged, washing away the satisfaction. This kind of unwillingness was because he suddenly thought of the complete primordial origin spiritual treasure that existed in the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Even the power of this fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure was already terrifying to this extent. How terrifying would the power of a complete primordial origin spiritual treasure be? However, a treasure with such terrifying might was actually restrained within the innate eternal spirit light in the end, and it was utterly impossible to take it out. It was even to the extent that it couldn't even reveal a trace of its might. How could he be willing to accept this? Just as Luo Fan was feeling unwilling, a figure gradually condensed in the distance. It was the figure of a young man. This man was different from all the supreme emperors he had seen before. There was not a single part of his body that looked ordinary. As he stood there, he exuded an intimidating aura from head to toe. His eyes were filled with a terrifying aura. In those eyes, there was a kind of supreme divine light that overlooked all living beings and all existences. Being looked at by that gaze, there was a feeling that he had suddenly become incomparably small, while the other party had suddenly become incomparably tall. Facing such a gaze, Luo Fan snorted coldly. "How should I address you, fellow cultivator? Why did you attack me?" "I just wanted to see if fellow cultivator had really refined this innate inextinguishable spiritual light," the man said indifferently. As he spoke, he had no intention of introducing himself at all. As for Luo Fan asking for his name, he pretended not to hear it. Seeing this attitude, how could Luo Fan not understand what it meant? It was clearly indicating that he was not qualified to know the man's name. "So, how do you feel now, fellow cultivator?" Luo Fan said indifferently. "I still cannot confirm whether fellow cultivator has refined this innate inextinguishable spiritual light or not." The man's expression became even colder. As he spoke, the high and mighty temperament on his body became even more intense and obvious. Following that, there was an inexplicable light that belonged to the inextinguishable spiritual light emitted from his body. This light was so obvious. It was so dense and so much of it. Under this light, this person did not look like a supreme emperor. Instead, he looked like the materialization of an inextinguishable spiritual light. It really is a level 3 emperor. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat and his expression darkened. This supreme emperor raised his hand and opened it. Endless light gathered in his palm. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into a pagoda. This pagoda had 33 levels. As the treasure light shot into the sky, the surrounding heaven and earth began to tremble violently. In fact, a cluster of pitch-black clouds in the sky started to gather again. However, unfortunately, just like before, the cloud disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Almost in the blink of an eye, the moment the treasure light sensed the cloud's appearance, it suddenly charged at the cloud, causing it to collapse. In the blink of an eye, it turned into countless tiny fragments and disappeared without a trace. Seeing this, Luo Fan's expression darkened. He knew what that cloud was at a glance. It was clearly the world sensing that an existence that could pose a threat to it had appeared in this world. Thus, it naturally condensed the tribulations and gathered its power to eliminate this existence. This kind of tribulations was originally aimed at this object. Its power was not something that this object could resist. However, at this moment, right in front of Luo Fan, the pagoda had completely dispersed the tribulations that were aimed at it with just a ray of treasure light. This kind of straightforwardness was really hard to believe. It seems that this is either a projection of the inextinguishable spiritual light or a fragment of a chaotic origin spiritual treasure. Luo Fan thought to himself. With this thought in mind, he did not hesitate to raise the V-shaped fragment of the chaotic origin spiritual treasure in his hand. Intense light emitted from the fragment. Immediately after, the fragment flickered and disappeared without a trace. At this moment, trillions of these fragments appeared out of thin air around the man's body, and they brazenly crushed towards the man. These trillions of fragments stacked together like a circular wall, completely covering the man's figure. No light that was originally emitted from the man's body could penetrate through. At this moment, the infinite light emitted by the 33-story pagoda was like countless sharp blades that brazenly pierced through the countless fragments, causing them to disappear one by one. Finally, there was only one fragment left. In a flash, it appeared in front of Luo Fan. When the fragment entered his hand, an incomparably hot feeling came from it. Even though Luo Fan was a supreme emperor, facing such a hot feeling, he still almost let go and threw the fragment to the side, so strong. As this thought flashed in his mind, Luo Fan cast his gaze towards where the man was. At this moment, the man's figure looked the same as before, but the treasure light of the 33-story pagoda seemed to have dimmed a little. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. The treasure light of the pagoda was actually affected. Didn't this mean that his attack just now was not so easy for the pagoda? At least, it wasn't as easy as it seemed. I originally only wanted you to give up on this connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Now it seems that you have no choice but to give up on this true sage treasure fragment. The man looked at Luo Fan as if nothing had happened and said so. As he spoke, he suddenly raised his hand and the 33-story pagoda in his hand soared into the sky. It expanded crazily in the sky, and in the blink of an eye, it had become tens of thousands of feet high and brazenly shrouded Luo Fan. This pagoda was so huge. Under its shroud, an endless amount of pressure surged out from Yi Zichen's mind. The pressure was so frightening that even the space and time of the primal chaos gate that was contaminated by the primal chaos began to undergo unimaginable changes under the pressure. The grayish existence was rapidly annihilated and turned into all sorts of unimaginable light and shadows, displaying all sorts of indescribable chaos at the same time. Luo Fan could clearly feel a kind of power that could easily crush him surging towards him from all directions. The strong pressure made whether it was his flesh and blood body or the spiritual light avatar inside it make ka sounds. It was as if the countless details inside were constantly breaking and shattering. Facing this situation, Luo Fan's expression became fierce. He shouted loudly. Endless spiritual light gushed out from his body and poured into the V-shaped primordial origin spiritual treasure fragment in his hand, directly making the primordial origin spiritual treasure fragment suddenly emit endless light. The source of this light was the spiritual light condensed by Luo Fan. But after the transformation of this fragment, its nature had already increased by who knows how many times, after the nature of this light had increased. Although its power had increased by who knows how many times, it still had a weakness. That was, Luo Fan had already lost control of this light. The power of the spiritual light condensed by Luo Fan had already increased to the limit of his control. Even when he condensed it into the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, it only changed its shape and its macroscopic structure. It was the same as building a house with a block of wood. Although its use seemed to be worlds apart, its essence hadn't changed much. In this case, the result of the increase in the quality of the spiritual light was that it naturally broke through the limit of his control. At this moment, Luo Fan lost control of the light. He could only let the light sense danger and automatically lock onto the 33-story pagoda that was pressing down on them. the light condensed into a six-fingered palm that brazenly reached up and directly collided with the pagoda. Silently, the grayish existence in the surroundings that had already gone through a round of destruction completely collapsed and was destroyed. Even the nothingness behind it had completely collapsed, revealing a strange, dusky state. Chaotic state. Then, the six-fingered palm that was condensed from the light trembled slightly. It seemed to have executed a technique that even left Luo Fan dumbfounded. Its power suddenly soared by who knows how many times. With a slight grab, the 33-story pagoda collapsed under its power. Countless fragments flew in all directions. At this moment, the face of the man who hadn't said his name suddenly changed. He opened his mouth and spat out a large mouthful of blood. Then, the light on his body seemed to be dyed with blood, and it began to quickly turn blood-red on his face. There was a look of disbelief. How is this possible? He only had time to say these words before the six-fingered palm swiped over and wiped away all traces of his existence. This was the connection between the six-fingered palm and the man. It naturally locked onto the man behind the pagoda and attacked him in a way that almost transcended the dimensions of space and time. The ability of the palm to wipe away the pagoda in an instant had obviously exceeded the limits of what the man could withstand. Naturally, he was completely wiped away by the palm, after the six-fingered palm wiped away the man. It swept around and flattened the surrounding space and time. It was like a layer of sand being wiped away, revealing the existence behind space and time. The dusky, chaotic state that could destroy all life if it came into contact with a single speck of it. At this moment, an incomparably pitch-black cloud condensed in the void. This cloud was even denser than the cloud that the man had condensed when he had condensed the pagoda. Its range was also much larger. After it appeared, it began to surge violently, and traces of lightning began to emerge from the cloud. At this moment, earth-shattering thunderclaps resounded, causing the surrounding space to tremble as though it had turned into a stormy sea. At this time, Luo Fan saw everything, but he could only watch. At this time, he was no longer pouring spirit light into the fragment to stimulate its power. Instead, the fragment had grabbed his body and frantically extracted spirit light from his body to exert its own power. Under such circumstances, unless Luo Fan's body collapsed, he simply couldn't stop the fragment from using his spirit light to do anything. At this moment, the six-fingered palm turned slightly and stretched straight toward the pitch-black cloud in the void. At this moment, the pitch-black cloud suddenly released an endless amount of lightning that struck down at the palm. These bolts of lightning did not fall from the sky like pillars like in the past. Instead, after they left the cloud, the lightning bolts fell from the sky. Instead, after they left the cloud, they directly turned and condensed into a long sword. A ray of light looked like a sword. It was a mysterious long sword that made people feel like they were being split apart. Around this long sword, there were countless strange lights shining faintly. There was also an indescribable smell of blood spreading from this long sword, causing the surrounding heaven and earth to be immersed in this bloody stench. After this long sword appeared, it stabbed straight at the six-fingered palm. During the process, space and time. It was as if it was made of paper that was easily cut open. The six-fingered palm trembled slightly in the void when it was stimulated, and it naturally made an extremely subtle and mysterious response. This response was so unfathomable. Even Luo Fan couldn't see the profoundness behind it. At that time, he had watched it very seriously and had clearly incorporated all the changes into his own life source and into the depths of his memory. However, when he turned his eyes away, he found that he had completely forgotten all the details of the changes in the palm. He only knew that the palm had made some indescribable changes. This is the means of a true divine. At this moment, Luo Fan understood. As he came to this realization, he realized exactly what was going on with that palm. This palm must have been the palm of the true divine, who had refined the primordial origin spiritual treasure that had been broken into countless pieces. Of course, at most, it was only the image of the palm or the trace left by the palm. There couldn't be more. After understanding this, countless thoughts flashed through his mind. The palm had 6 fingers, but this was definitely not the appearance that a Kanei Taoism body in the Earth universe or this strange perfect world should have. In other words, this primordial origin spiritual treasure fragment definitely didn't come from any of the 7 true divine in the Earth universe. It could only come from another perfect world, or even another great world. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but feel a chill. From another perfect world. Did the true divine fight with someone in the state of chaos and his primordial origin spiritual treasure was broken, and your fragment randomly drifted here? Or did the true divine set his eyes on the Earth universe, and in the battle of invasion and resistance, the primordial origin spiritual treasure was broken, and its fragment came here? If it was the first situation, then it was fine, and it had nothing to do with him. But if it was the second situation, then the situation could not be any worse. Chapter 1694. Under the mysterious transformation, the 6-fingered palm easily caught the strange lightning longsword in its hand. With a slight tremble, the electric longsword collapsed with a loud bang. In the blink of an eye, it completely turned into nothingness, as if it had never appeared before. It disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the tribulation clouds in the sky reacted again. It was unknown how many phantoms appeared in the tribulation clouds. These phantoms were extremely mysterious. They looked like magical treasures that trembled and flickered in the tribulation clouds. They emitted all kinds of unimaginable light and produced all kinds of unimaginable pressure. Luo Fan looked over and instantly understood what was going on with these phantoms. They were the projections of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure that had once appeared in this world. The reason why he knew this was because he saw an extremely familiar figure among the many phantoms. It was a 3-legged cauldron. In other words, it was the divine court heavenly cauldron that Luo Fan had successfully refined. Ever since the divine court heavenly cauldron was successfully refined, Luo Fan had rarely used it. This was because his strength had already reached an unimaginable level. Although the divine court heavenly cauldron was powerful, it was nothing to him. He could easily surpass the power of the divine court heavenly cauldron. However, the divine court heavenly cauldron had already appeared in this world. Its traces and marks had long been deeply engraved in the depths of this world. In this way, he could naturally summon the projection of the tribulation clouds and have it appear in the depths of the tribulation clouds to attack the palm that Luo Fan had formed with the help of the V-shaped fragment. In the face of such a change, the 6-fingered palm trembled slightly. A handprint that Luo Fan had never seen before formed in the void, but just by looking at it, he could tell that it contained the endless mysteries of a true saint. The changes of the handprint were so complicated that it had even exceeded the limits of what Luo Fan could bear. He felt dizzy just looking at it, not to mention trying to create it. Moreover, it was stopping him from creating the handprint. There was also an even more important factor. That was, this handprint was formed by 6 fingers. Naturally, these 6 fingers were not like those of an ordinary person with a deformed palm. One of the 6 fingers could not be moved at all, and even if it could be moved, it would be extremely stiff. Every single one of those 6 fingers was extremely nimble. Furthermore, every single one of those fingers cooperated closely with each other as they attacked. It was extremely exquisite. It could be said that if any of the fingers were missing, then not only would the might of the attack be greatly reduced, it might even cause a backlash in the end and injure the palm instead. This was clearly not just because the owner of the palm was extremely intelligent and was able to think of countless exquisite methods to use the 6th finger. It was definitely an extremely grand object. It could only be achieved with the support of the vast 6-fingered civilization. Only after countless years of development and the wisdom of countless living beings had they been enlightened. Only by organizing and creating could such an exquisite method of using the 6 fingers be formed. If any of the conditions were not met, the method of using the 6 fingers would definitely be different. After the 6-fingered palm made the hand seal, the heavenly Dragon King's body trembled. The surrounding world underwent an incomparably shocking change. In a trance, even the rules and laws seemed to undergo some indescribable change. Even the endless fragments of the great Tao and the mysteries of true sages in the surroundings seemed to be organized and gathered by some kind of inconceivable and terrifying power at this moment. They condensed into an extremely incredible structure, forming a strange space-time that surrounded the handprint. Or rather, a strange space-time dimension. Immediately after, the space-time dimension and the space-time dimension were sent up along the palm and into the tribulation cloud above the void. With an earth-shattering rumble, the projections of the countless pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures that had just been summoned in the tribulation cloud were completely shattered. The terrifying impact instantly tore apart the tribulation cloud, causing it to turn into countless fragments in the blink of an eye and quickly dissipate into nothingness. When the tribulation cloud disappeared, the surrounding world seemed to have completely changed. Even the indescribable existence that had originally enveloped the entire world seemed to have disappeared at this moment. At the very least, within this range, it was no longer possible to sense that indescribable existence. In fact, it wasn't just that indescribable existence that had disappeared. Even the realm source that Luo Fan had always sensed in his heart seemed to have been covered in a layer of fog at this moment. It became faintly discernible, illusory, and real at the same time. Wanting to send his mind into the realm source once again became a fool's dream. At this moment, the 6-fingered palm was still unwilling to give up. It began to change its hand seals, and hand seals that surpassed the limits of his understanding appeared one after another. And during this process, Luo Fan also felt an incomparably astonishing attractive force being produced from the V-shaped fragment. It was frantically acting on his body, extracting the endless spiritual light and power within his body, turning it into power for the 6-fingered palm. This allowed the 6-fingered palm to change its hand seals as it pleased. A feeling of exhaustion gradually rose from the bottom of his heart. Everything seemed to have been extracted during this process, and he faintly felt that his entire body was about to collapse. This can't go on. If this goes on, my spirit light clone will be destroyed. And if the spirit light clone is destroyed, this body of flesh and blood will also collapse. When that happens, won't this connate inextinguishable spirit light leave me? At this moment, this thought directly appeared in Luo Fan's mind. A feeling of anxiety gradually emerged. The fragment clearly didn't care about what Luo Fan thought. It only instinctively followed the traces left on his body by the true saint and continuously extracted all the energy that could be extracted to execute the technique. It completely didn't care whether Luo Fan could bear it or not. Luo Fan was extremely anxious, and he tried his best to think of what to do. Giving up this spirit light clone was equivalent to giving up the connate inextinguishable spirit light. Obviously, Luo Fan wouldn't agree to it in the end. After pondering for a long time, the 6-fingered palm had already changed hundreds of hand seals. In the end, when the surrounding space-time dimension had almost become an extremely vast, almost perfect world, he had a flash of inspiration and finally came up with a solution. With this thought in mind, without hesitation, he turned his body and directly drilled into the connate inextinguishable spirit light. If he didn't resonate with the connate inextinguishable spirit light, his drilling would definitely not have any effect. After all, the primordial spiritual treasure fragment could only frantically extract his power and his spirit light. There was clearly an inexplicable power that was imprisoning him in place. Unless he was in peak condition, he wouldn't be able to move at all. However, He had a resonance with the connate inextinguishable spirit light. This allowed him to control the power of the connate inextinguishable spirit light. Although he couldn't use it to fight enemies outside of the connate inextinguishable spirit light, it was completely no problem for him to suck himself in. Therefore, at this moment, when he drilled into the connate inextinguishable spirit light, his body produced a thunderous explosion. Amidst the explosion, endless and terrifying shock waves erupted from his body. They swept in all directions, directly flattening the area within the chaos gate that was already enveloped by the inexplicable space-time dimension. This caused this place to completely turn into a chaotic scene. This scene even made people wonder if Luo Fan had already self-destructed. At this moment, Luo Fan's body trembled, and he disappeared on the spot. He directly entered the connate inextinguishable spirit light and disappeared without a trace, just as Luo Fan entered the connate inextinguishable spirit light. An indescribable isolating power appeared on his body. The V-shaped fragment swayed and suddenly stopped extracting the spirit light and power from Luo Fan's body. He felt his body relax, and there was a long-lost comfort that surged up. At the same time, outside the connate inextinguishable spirit light, the six-fingered palm had lost its source of power. Although its power still existed, it couldn't continue to execute the hand seal that it had originally prepared. At this moment, the terrifying power contained in the hand seal instantly caused a backlash. At this moment, the entire world felt an earth-shattering tremor. An extremely shocking light swept across the entire world at this moment, causing all living creatures in this world, from the supreme emperors to the ordinary creatures without intelligence, to feel that the entire world had lit up at this moment. They even vaguely felt an indescribable impact from the inside out. It kept impacting their bodies, impacting their souls, impacting their everything, causing them to faintly undergo an indescribable change. This change was the most fundamental change to the world. It caused the endless great path fragments and the mysteries of the true saints to inexplicably condense. Countless great path fragments unknowingly condensed into an indescribable great path, like a silk net that covered the entire world. This was the result of the hand seal not being completed. One could imagine what kind of incredible changes would happen to the entire world once the hand seal was completed. The world was filled with endless anger at this moment. In an instant, the entire world began to tremble violently. This kind of trembling was not caused by the hand seal of the six-fingered palm. Instead, the world was actively trembling. In this trembling, all the great path fragments, all the mysteries of the true saints, and all the rules and laws in the entire world began to tremble violently. It also produced all sorts of incredible changes. From the originally quiet and peaceful state, it became an explosive state. It began to crazily impact the threads of the great path that had just been formed because of the hand seal, causing the threads of the great path to continuously break and collapse. After a long time, all the great path fragments were completely crushed and turned back into great path fragments, allowing the world to completely return to its original state. In the process of the world's transformation, all the living creatures in this world felt as if a great disaster was about to befall them. In a trance, he felt that the entire world seemed to have come to life at this moment, as if it had become an unimaginable existence. It started to want to completely erase everything in this world, as if it wanted to kill all the living beings in this world. At this moment, all the living creatures were trembling in fear. Some even directly prostrated themselves in worship, begging the world to let them go, and at this moment, the source of all the changes, which was the six-fingered palm, had already been devoured by the power of the hand seal. It collapsed with a loud bang, directly destroying the strange space-time dimension that was formed by the hand seal. It even directly wiped out that position. All the great path fragments and the mysteries of the true saints had completely disappeared, revealing a rare void. There was no mysteries or power at all. Such a change. It was naturally within Luo Fan's senses. Even though he had already entered the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, it was impossible for him to completely give up control of the world outside. How could he not understand this change, that even involved the change of the entire world's rules? It almost completely changed the entire world. A true saint is indeed a true saint. Even if it only leaves a small trace, it can still change the world. Luo Fan sighed. He could even imagine that if he had really allowed the hand seal to be used just now, the entire world would definitely have turned into a completely different appearance. All the living creatures in this world would either be completely destroyed because they could not adapt to the new world, or they would completely adapt to the new world and completely turn into a different race. And after that, the most likely thing that would happen was that the unknown true saint's trace in the fragment might leave and eventually enter somewhere in this world to reincarnate and be reborn. And after that, the most likely thing that would happen was that the unknown true saint's trace in the fragment might leave and eventually enter somewhere in this world to be reincarnated and reborn. In the future, it might even break through the gap between the real and the fake, turn the fake into the real, and become a true saint. Thinking of this, even with Luo Fan's will, he could not help but shiver. If it really came to that, not to mention whether he could continue to cultivate in this world, even his life might be easily erased. The more one understood the existence of a true saint, the more one felt that it was incredible, and the clearer one understood how supreme it was. Back then, when Luo Fan had just created the cultivation method in the primordial world, he even dared to directly create the Tao fruit Great Tao that led to the true saint realm. Even though the creation process was actually created with the help of Pangu's primordial spirit, it was still based on his own will, which showed how big his heart was. However, as time passed and his cultivation realm continued to increase, when he reached the Khanate Zenith Heaven realm, he realized that there was actually a quasi-saint level above the Khanate Zenith Heaven realm and before the primordial chaos Tao fruit that was recorded in his Tao fruit Great Tao. Only by passing the extremely huge quasi-saint level could he obtain the primordial chaos Tao fruit and step into the true saint level. After that, when he cultivated to the peak of the quasi-saint level, he realized that there was still an unreachable distance from the true saint. He still needed to cross the 9th level of the pseudo-saint level to be possible. Just like that, the more he improved, the more he felt the vastness of the true saint, and the more he realized how far he was from the true saint. Until now, when he had truly reached the supreme emperor level, and was tens of thousands of times more powerful than ordinary pseudo-saints, he still couldn't clearly understand how powerful a true saint was. In this way, if a true saint appeared in this world, what kind of situation would he fall into? Luo Fan almost didn't dare to think about it. A true saint is indeed a true saint. In the end, he ended the process of the change in his thinking with this repeated sigh. After all, what appeared was only a trace of a true saint's technique. Although the impact was extremely shocking, it was still within the range that this world could bear. After a few days, the world had completely erased all the changes caused by the six-fingered palm, causing the world to return to its original appearance. Not only the great Tao fragments, but the area that the six-fingered palm had destroyed had also been completely restored. The absolute nothingness that had existed for a few days had been completely replaced by the state of endless great Tao fragments and endless mysteries of the true saint in the normal world. If it wasn't for the fact that the scene from that time still remained in his memory, perhaps Luo Fan would have doubted whether such a drastic change had really happened back then. After a few days of recovery, Luo Fan's spiritual light clone and body had also recovered. After all, his life source hadn't been damaged much, so the spiritual light and power that had been consumed could naturally be continuously created by him out of thin air. In this way, it wasn't difficult to make up for the consumption of the spiritual light clone. A few days. It was already enough. As for his body of flesh and blood, it was even simpler. The path that this body of flesh and blood took was completely in accordance with the internal cultivation path of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. In this way, it would naturally be able to receive endless replenishment in the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. Even if the entire body collapsed and was destroyed, it could recover in the blink of an eye, and it would recover to its peak faster than Luo Fan's spiritual light clone. It's about time. Feeling that his entire body had recovered to its peak, Luo Fan thought to himself. With this thought, he began to contact his main body, wanting to directly move the innate inextinguishable spiritual light over through spacetime. As for the Level 3 Emperor who had previously intercepted him and wanted to take away the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, he could only wait until the innate inextinguishable spiritual light was completely absorbed into his main body, and then he could search for it again without any worries. At this moment, a figure emitting a familiar light appeared out of thin air outside the Chaos Gate, facing Luo Fan from afar. I didn't expect you to have a fragment of a true sage treasure. It seems like I've underestimated you before, the figure said after appearing. As he spoke, the surrounding spacetime suddenly underwent a wonderful change, and an indescribable barrier appeared between Luo Fan and his main body. This barrier didn't block the fundamental connection between his main body and his clone. However, it blocked the spacetime connection between his main body and his clone. As a result, if his main body wanted to move his clone over through spacetime, it wouldn't be as simple as before, and he would need to break through an extremely tough barrier in order to do so. Under normal circumstances, it naturally wouldn't have any effect on him. He only needed to use a little bit of strength. By changing the way he moved slightly, he could naturally transcend spacetime and directly move anything over. However, at this moment the situation was different. At this moment, there was a Level 3 Emperor who had mastered the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. How could he let Luo Fan do as he pleased? What do you mean? Luo Fan frowned and said calmly. His figure slowly appeared outside the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, faintly emitting an inexplicable murderous aura, showing how bad his mood was. Seeing this scene, the figure only showed a cold smile on his face and said, "Any emperor who wants to keep the innate inextinguishable spiritual light must pass a test before it will be recognized. If you fail the test, you are not qualified to possess the innate inextinguishable spiritual light." Test? Who is qualified to test me? Luo Fan's heart sank and he said coldly, "Everyone is qualified." The man said calmly, "As long as you are an emperor who is interested in the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, you are qualified. An expert, if you don't even have the courage to accept the challenge, how can you want to possess the innate inextinguishable spiritual light?" Luo Fan came to a sudden realization, and he sneered. "What test? So it's just a whitewash of your greed, an excuse for you to seize the city of salvation. In essence, there is no difference. But, do you think this can be avoided? In the secular world, there is a saying that treasuring a jade ring a crime. If you can't even protect the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, how can you be qualified to possess it?" The Level 3 Emperor said calmly. These words had already made the matter clear, causing Luo Fan to feel unhappy in his heart. However, there was nothing much to say. That was the truth. The innate inextinguishable spiritual light was so precious that it was almost equivalent to making one eternal and indestructible. One could imagine how tempting it was to cultivators. If one didn't display enough strength to make other cultivators wary, who would admit that one was qualified to possess the innate inextinguishable spiritual light? Who would think that they couldn't replace you in controlling the innate inextinguishable spiritual light? As for the hidden rules and the like, it could only deceive ghosts. Thinking of this, Luo Fan slowly took out the V-shaped fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure, and said lightly, "After seeing the method I used a few days ago, you still think that I don't have the qualifications, and still dare to appear in front of me. It seems that you already have the confidence to deal with this treasure, right? Then show it to me. Chapter 1695. It really is a fragment of a true sage treasure. Not only can I obtain the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, but I can also obtain a fragment of a true sage treasure that is no less valuable than the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. It really makes me jealous. The man had an inexplicable look on his face. As that expression appeared on his face, a long river appeared on his body. This river was so pure, so mystical. Within it, there were bits and pieces of waves that were constantly undulating and surging. Within the waves, one could faintly see an endless light and shadow. It seemed to be an endless mystery, but it also seemed to be a meaningless thing. After this long river appeared, it naturally emitted a kind of eternal and indestructible aura. Luo Fan could only sense such an aura from one kind of existence. That was the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Apart from the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, nothing else, not even the shadow of a true sage, the voice of a true sage, or the way of a true sage, would have such an eternal and inextinguishable aura. This is the connate inextinguishable spiritual light? Luo Fan's pupils shrank. At this moment, he suddenly understood why the man in front of him had dared to appear in front of him and block him, even though he clearly knew that he had the primordial spiritual treasure fragment. Impossible! Without becoming a true sage, no one can perfectly use the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Very soon, Luo Fan overturned his previous thoughts. The connate inextinguishable spiritual light itself was an existence of the true sage level. Perhaps, a supreme emperor who had yet to become a true saint could rely on all kinds of fortuitous encounters and incomparably long years to deeply engrave their mark into the depths of the innate inextinguishable spirit light, making it their own. However, it was absolutely impossible for them to control the connate inextinguishable spiritual light like a true sage could. Not to mention that the supreme emperor in front of him could casually change its characteristics. To be able to carry out such exquisite manipulation, this is indeed not the real connate inextinguishable spiritual light. The man said lightly. Hearing this, Luo Fan's eyes relaxed a little. No matter what it was, as long as it wasn't the true innate inextinguishable spirit light, it meant that the situation wasn't so bad that it couldn't be resisted. The man suddenly smiled and said, "However, this is the power of the innate indestructible spirit light and the essence of the innate indestructible spirit light. Compared to the real innate indestructible spirit light, its power is not much weaker." Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression turned ugly again. Although such a condensed existence wasn't the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, it was still able to condense. However, its power was already much stronger and more terrifying than the projection of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. For Luo Fan, all he could think of now was one way to resist it. That was to do what he did before and directly stimulate the trace of a true saint contained within the V-shaped primordial essence spirit treasure fragment. Only that trace was left. Only then would he be able to unleash the terrifying might of the attack that was condensed from this power and innate indestructible essence. However, if that was the case, the result would be, it would be very difficult to control. Various thoughts flashed through his mind. In the end, he clenched his teeth and poured his spiritual light into the V-shaped fragment in his hand. As the spiritual light poured in, the V-shaped fragment began to strengthen the spiritual light crazily. The crazy condensation caused the spiritual light to suddenly strengthen by many times. It was completely out of Luo Fan's control. After that, the light began to condense rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had already condensed into a six-fingered palm, which brazenly slapped at the man. "Sure enough, it's this move again." The man just sneered. At this moment, the long river that he had sent out turned slightly. In the blink of an eye, it condensed into two palms. they formed two palms, and as they changed in the void, they had already formed two mysterious handprints that exuded incredible power. With a slight tremble, they brazenly blasted towards the six-fingered palm. The power that erupted from these two handprints was unbelievably strong. At this moment, the entire world seemed to have been enveloped by these two handprints. It was as if the entire world was providing power to these two hand seals. Endless power and power were crazily poured into these two hand seals, causing them to become more and more powerful and huge. In the end, it was as if the entire world was about to be destroyed. Facing such an attack, the six-fingered palm didn't have the slightest change. It just moved slightly. The 6 fingers slightly shook, as if condensing into a handprint, but it also seemed like it was just a meaningless movement. Then, the 6-fingered palm brazenly collided with the two handprints. Rumble! An earth-shaking thunderclap rang out. Amidst this sound, at this moment, the entire world felt a kind of vibration from the bottom of its heart. It spread out. Every living being, every sovereign's cave abode, and every world that they had created shook violently at this moment. It looked as if a huge bottle had directly contained their cave abode, their world, and was shaking violently. At this moment, almost all the third-grade sovereigns looked thoughtfully at the place where Luo Fan and the man were fighting. I didn't expect him to grasp such a divine ability so quickly. I still underestimated him back then. In an area not far from Luo Fan, the world sovereign broke away from the process of comprehending the mysteries contained in the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and let out a sigh. After this sigh, he withdrew all his attention and continued to fully immerse himself in the comprehension that he was in before. He no longer paid any attention to the outside world. In another location, another supreme sovereign who also grasped the innate inextinguishable spiritual light sneered. To actually be able to grasp such strength, it seems that you are qualified for me to make a move. As he spoke, he put down what he was originally doing and focused more attention on the battle between Luo Fan and the man. The spiritual light on his body was eager to give it a try. The innate inextinguishable spiritual light that had condensed into a huge sphere and slowly rotated began to produce an inexplicable fluctuation. Its power fluctuated as if it was ready to attack. Similar to this person, 5 or 6 of the other supreme sovereigns who grasped the innate inextinguishable spiritual light had the same thought. As their thoughts changed, the atmosphere of the entire world began to change. It was as if a storm was brewing. Luo Fan didn't care about their various actions at all. At this moment, he was enduring the V-shaped fragment that was frantically extracting his spiritual light, extracting his power and turning it into the power of the six-fingered palm. He was entangled with the man's attack. Although the man's attack wasn't the main body of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, with the power of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, its power wasn't any weaker than the fragment at this moment. Even though Luo Fan had already unleashed the strongest power of the fragment, the other party still performed brilliantly. The two palms changed into all kinds of mysterious hand seals, producing all kinds of incredible effects as they constantly entangled with the six-fingered palm. During the battle, both sides displayed profound mysteries that almost surpassed the limits of Luo Fan's comprehension. The scene of the battle was also grand to an unbelievable level. If such a battle were to take place on Earth, at this moment, most of Earth's universe would probably be destroyed because of this. Perhaps it would cause a true saint to make a move, but here, in this strange and perfect world, the impact of this battle was limited to a radius of a few 100 million light-years. Everything within this radius of a few 100 million light-years. Because of this battle, all kinds of incredible worlds were reconstructed and combined into countless unimaginable great daos. Under such terrifying changes, the space-time within a radius of a few 100 million light-years seemed to have turned into plasticine, being casually smashed, recombined, and molded into all kinds of unimaginable shapes. In this battle, the six-fingered palm seemed to be able to move with ease. Although its overall strength was inferior to that of the two palms, its movements were graceful and free. However, his movements were graceful and free. Every time he attacked, he used the slightest of techniques to obtain the strongest effect. If it wasn't for the endless power of the two palms and the rich innate indestructible essence that gave Luo Fan a crushing advantage, perhaps he would have already been crushed by the six-fingered palm. How could it still be like this, where both sides were in a deadlock, neither side able to suppress the other? However, for Luo Fan, this battle could only be a spectator. The V-shaped fragment continued to extract his spirit light and his power, turning them into power for the six-fingered palm. After the previous extraction, although his spirit light and power hadn't been exhausted because of this, the pain of having everything extracted still made his expression extremely unsightly. However, the pain of having everything extracted still made his expression extremely unsightly. On the other hand, the man's expression wasn't very good either. However, Luo Fan's expression was unsightly because his power had been extracted and he couldn't bear it. However, the man's expression was the complete opposite. His expression was unsightly because there was too much power flowing into his body and it was too difficult for him to control it. Luo Fan relied on his own spirit light and his own power to use this fragment, but the man was different. The winding river that the man used relied on the power of the innate indestructible spirit light and the innate indestructible essence of the innate indestructible spirit light. How vast was the power of the innate indestructible spirit light! How rich was its essence! He wasn't a true sage, so how could he control it perfectly? The entire process seemed casual, but in fact, he wasn't much better than Luo Fan. In comparison, he only had to slightly guide the direction of the attack. Apart from that, everything else was completely dependent on the natural reaction of the innate indestructible spirit light. Fellow Taoist, do you still want to continue? Luo Fan frowned and said. At this time, the situation was quite obvious. Both Luo Fan and the man couldn't win at all. Moreover, the entire process was extremely torturous for both of them. What was the point of continuing to fight like this? The man only smiled faintly and said, Fellow Taoist, are you going to surrender? Hearing this, Luo Fan sighed and knew that there was nothing more to say. He only said, Then let's see who can last longer. Hearing this, the man only smiled faintly. At this moment, the six-fingered palm seemed to be indescribably angry because it couldn't take down the opponent for a long time. Suddenly, it made an unprecedented gesture. With this gesture, the void suddenly shook violently. This vibration was different from all the previous vibrations. The previous vibrations were caused by the impact of heaven and earth being too strong. However, at this moment, this vibration was directly born from the depths of heaven and earth. It felt like there was something in the depths of heaven and earth that was constantly charging outwards, as though it wanted to cross an endless distance to arrive. At this moment, an indescribable sense of danger arose in the man's heart. This sense of danger felt like he was standing in front of his natural enemy before he had cultivated a great divine ability. He had to bear the sense of danger produced by the two flickering greedy, fierce, and ruthless gazes. Not good. Such a thought instinctively emerged in his mind. With this thought, he no longer cared about anything else. With a thought, half of his body suddenly collapsed. As his body collapsed, it was 100 times stronger than before. The power of the innate indestructible spirit light and the innate indestructible essence emerged from his body and directly poured into the two palms formed by the long river. Each of the two palms suddenly became more than 10 times more solid. As the two palms became solid, the power contained in the two palms suddenly increased by who knows how many times. For a moment, a unique space-time dimension that belonged to the two palms was born. Immediately after, the space-time dimension erupted with a world-destroying power. Like Mars crashing into Earth, it brazenly crushed the six-fingered palms. Originally, the six-fingered palms and the two palms were in a stalemate. Now that the two palms suddenly became 100 times stronger, the situation of the battle was naturally reversed in an instant. The six-fingered palms seemed to receive an indescribably terrifying pressure, and countless fragments began to scatter from the six-fingered palms. This was obviously the sign of the shattering. *T. Luo Fan cried inwardly. However, at this moment, the one in control of the battle was not him, but the six-fingered palms. Even if he was anxious, he could not change the current situation. He could not make the six-fingered palms recover. He could only cry inwardly. At this moment, the space-time dimension within a radius of hundreds of millions of light-years suddenly distorted. The space-time dimension seemed to have completely paused at this moment. Everything suddenly stopped. Looking up, everything within a radius of hundreds of millions of light-years seemed to have become a scene in a painting. What's going on? At this moment, both Luo Fan and the man were puzzled. While they were puzzled, the space-time dimension that seemed to have been paused trembled slightly. Immediately after, a soft poof was heard. This soft sound was naturally rather inconspicuous in the chaotic and earth-shattering commotion within the range of hundreds of millions of light-years. It was enough for anyone to overlook it. However, at this moment, when everything seemed to have paused and everything seemed to have paused, this soft sound was naturally as obvious as a thunderclap. As this soft sound was heard, in the void in front of Luo Fan, an object suddenly broke through the void and appeared out of thin air. Behind the broken void, one could faintly see an endless gray existence. There was also an incomparably rich, chaotic aura seeping out of it. From this appearance, it was obvious that it was in a state of chaos. In other words, the thing that appeared in front of him also emerged from a state of chaos. What is this thing? That object was extremely strange. Although he clearly knew that it was an object, there was a unique space-time dimension around it that blocked all vision and senses from the outside world. It made it impossible for him to clearly see what kind of object it was, nor was he able to recognize its shape. At this moment, the V-shaped fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure in Luo Fan's hand trembled slightly. The unique space-time dimension that Luo Fan had already mastered suddenly resonated with the space-time dimension of the thing that appeared in front of him. The space-time dimensions of the two began to gradually blend and assimilate. At this time, how could Luo Fan not understand? This thing that appeared was clearly a fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure. In fact, he should have thought of this. If it wasn't a fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure, how could it come out of the state of chaos? If it wasn't a fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure, how could there be such an independent space-time dimension? If it wasn't a fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure, how could it cause the space-time dimension within a radius of hundreds of millions of light-years to be frozen at this moment? At this moment, he was both happy and surprised. He was happy that there was one more fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure, and he was one step closer to completion. He was surprised. The fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure had actually appeared at this time. It had to be known that the fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure was not so easy to obtain. Every fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure had to undergo a test for the holder. Or a trial. This kind of test was extremely difficult. If one wasn't careful, their entire body and mind would be completely immersed, becoming more miserable than being refined by the inextinguishable connate spiritual light. If this happened at a normal time, although this test was difficult, he had all kinds of cards in his hand. Although he would deal with it carefully, but he wouldn't panic. He still had enough confidence that he could pass the test. But, right now, he was in the middle of a battle with another Supreme Emperor, and he was being tested at such a time. That was simply adding hail to snow. How could he not be shocked? However, although he was extremely unwilling to be tested by this fragment of the primordial origin's spiritual treasure at this time, but this was not under his control. When the V-shaped fragment and the space-time dimension around the newly appeared fragment completely mixed together, boundless blood light spread out. It directly wrapped Luo Fan in it. Then, he found that he had been thrown into a boundless universe of negative emotions, becoming an insignificant ordinary mortal in this universe. The boundless negative emotions, from all directions and through all kinds of channels, constantly poured into his body, poured into his soul, and pulled him constantly into the abyss of negative emotions. This universe of negative emotions was even more terrifying than the universe of negative emotions he had encountered before. The negative emotions in it were more numerous and even more astonishing. In that universe of negative emotions, the pressure that Luo Fan felt was even greater than before. Almost in an instant, Luo Fan felt that everything about him had been completely infected by the negative emotions. Only the last bit of clarity remained at the core of the fusion of the world's laws. Moreover, even the position occupied by this bit of the world's laws was still under the impact of endless negative emotions. It constantly produced unstable shocks, as if it could collapse at any time, causing him to lose even the last bit of clarity. Now that he had fallen into this situation, Luo Fan was very wise to put everything that happened in the outside world behind him. He wholeheartedly guarded the little bit of clarity in his heart, and worked hard to strengthen his world's laws, so that this world's laws could be as stable as possible in the face of the impact of the endless negative emotions. After all, he had already experienced this a few times before. This kind of thing was not difficult at all to do at this time. Although there were many and strong negative emotions around him, in the end, they could not really break through Luo Fan's world's laws. They could only linger outside the little bit of clarity, but could not really penetrate into it in this process. The world's laws that he felt was extremely perfect gradually revealed its originally hidden flaws. Bit by bit, the impurities that could not be stabilized were constantly being removed at this time, causing his world's laws to become purer and more condensed. In this state of resisting the impact of the negative emotions, the passage of time was completely meaningless to him. After an unknown amount of time, perhaps it was just a short moment, or perhaps hundreds of billions of years had passed, a sense of relaxation suddenly emerged in Luo Fan's heart. Under this sense of relaxation, Luo Fan's mind recovered a little. After recovering, he found that in the depths of his heart, the world's laws that protected his little bit of clarity had become crystal clear and flawless again. Chapter 1696. This world view of laws that had become crystal clear without any impurities was like an extremely strong crystal at this moment, resisting the endless negative emotions around him. Even if the universe of negative emotions exhausted the power of the entire universe to infect him and turn him into a part of the universe of negative emotions, it was still difficult to break through. Moreover, at the same time, an inexplicable comprehension began to emerge in his little bit of clarity, and it began to gradually fill the world view of laws. It was decomposed and assimilated by the world view, and in the end it completely turned into a part of the world view, becoming resources for the growth of the world view of laws. These mysteries and comprehensions were naturally the various comprehensions that Luo Fan had of cultivation, the great Tao, the way of the true sage, the universe, the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, and the state of chaos after he perfected the world view of laws the last time, and the number of these mysteries had reached an unimaginable level. After all, during this period of time, Luo Fan had been constantly comprehending the mysteries of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light through a mysterious method. This comprehension had even reached the level where his condensed body had become a 5 worlds false sage in the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, forming a resonance with the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. It was self-evident how much he had comprehended. As for his comprehension of the state of chaos, there was no need to mention it. He had comprehended the state of chaos for as long as 30 million years. Even if he was a pig, he would definitely have a huge harvest. Not to mention that Luo Fan's own comprehension ability was almost the best in the world, and almost no one could compare to him. Was there a need to mention the amount of harvest he had? As for the other things, they could all be developed from the comprehension of these two aspects, and there were many of them. It was also unimaginable. In this way, the number of these existences that could be turned into resources for the worldview of laws was naturally innumerable. If it was under normal circumstances, it would take at least a few million years for Luo Fan to transform these countless comprehensions into resources for the growth of the worldview of laws. But at this time, with a little bit of clarity in the depths of his heart, there was no need for this process at all. It was as if the world of laws was actively absorbing the various mysteries and comprehensions of the world of laws, fusing the various things that were beneficial to the growth of the world of laws into the depths of its body. As a result, his body continued to grow, and the crystal-clear view of the world began to gradually spreading towards his entire soul. The reason for this change. The reason was simple. Because, in the last bit of clarity in the depths of his heart, Luo Fan had no emotions at all. There were no distracting thoughts at all. That was the most fundamental thing. It was merely the existence of the transcendent will that had supported him for billions of trillions of years. This kind of state where only a bit of fundamental will existed was a state that was close to the Tao. In such a state, however, he was able to comprehend what he wanted to comprehend and do what he wanted to do in a way that far surpassed what he originally did. Therefore, that was why he was able to comprehend all these things at this moment, and these profundities were crazily being infused into his worldview. Of course, this state was very powerful. It was so incredible, but it didn't mean that he could shorten the cultivation that he originally needed by entering this state. This state could only be used to transform the mysteries and comprehensions into resources for the world of laws. Nothing else could be done in this state. The reason was very simple, because this state itself needed to isolate all thoughts and thoughts, leaving only the most fundamental transcendent will. For this transcendent will, comprehending anything else was just a distracting thought. Only by enriching the world of laws, strengthening and perfecting the world of laws, allowing this world of laws to finally cross the boundary between true and false, and finally step into the true sage level, could it be regarded as the fundamental, not a distracting thought, and only then could it exist. In this way, how could he comprehend other divine abilities, wonderful techniques, the mysteries of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, and so on in this state? In this state, Luo Fan's crystal-clear world of laws continued to expand. After an unknown period of time, this world of laws grew to a sufficient strength, and finally filled his entire mind again, allowing his mind to be completely protected by this world of laws. At this point, his thoughts, his emotions, all of his thoughts, and all of his rationality had naturally been completely restored. The state of only having the transcendent will to support this world of laws was naturally lost. The loss of this state meant that he could no longer continue to transform his various comprehensions into resources for the world of laws at a heaven-defying speed like before. The speed at which the world of laws expanded began to slow down. What a pity! At this moment, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. What he sighed was naturally the loss of that state, and the inability to transform comprehension and mysteries into resources for the improvement of the world of laws as he pleased. However, he didn't immerse himself in that pity for too long. Very soon, this feeling of pity disappeared without a trace, and all his attention began to be focused on the universe of negative emotions in front of him. The entire universe of negative emotions was many times stronger than the one he encountered previously. Almost all the living beings in it were stronger than Luo Fan. In it, he could even feel an incomparably terrifying, omnipotent, eternal, and indestructible true sage aura existing in the deepest part of the universe. That was obviously the sage in this universe of negative emotions. Perhaps it was the most fundamental of this universe of negative emotions, the false sage that was completely integrated with the entire universe of negative emotions, or perhaps it was the true sage that was not shackled to any universe, any spacetime, any heaven and earth, or even the state of chaos. Although Luo Fan was a supreme emperor at this time, and his mind was completely protected by the world of laws, he was completely unaffected by any negative emotions in the outside world. However, in this universe of negative emotions, even if it was a false sage, it was enough to make him anxious and unable to defeat it. That was because this universe of negative emotions was simply too strong. Becoming a false sage here was equivalent to completely merging with the entire universe of negative emotions. Every move one made would be able to trigger the boundless power of the entire universe of negative emotions. The boundless power was enough to completely crush Luo Fan, who could only barely protect himself in this universe. Facing such a state, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. He felt an inexplicable sense of vigilance in his heart. With his past experience, Luo Fan understood that he didn't need to completely destroy the entire universe of negative emotions to be able to escape. What he needed to do, he just needed to reconnect his mind with his body in this universe and find his body again. Everything else, such as destroying the universe, changing the entire universe, and so on, were all in service of this goal. Therefore, after knowing that there might be such a thing in this universe of negative emotions that he couldn't resist at all, he instantly decided that he would do something completely different from before when he was faced with a supreme expert who could destroy him with a single pinch. This entire universe, according to Luo Fan's own concept, it looked like a boundless starry sky. Each and every one of them was a star. Many river systems were distributed in the depths of the boundless and deep starry sky, shining with all sorts of indescribable lights. What was different from ordinary universes was, everything in the entire universe was condensed from the accumulation of negative emotions. Be it the stars, the essence of the stars that filled the starry sky, or the endless free energy, they were all negative emotions. The endless negative emotions existed in an extremely strange manner. They condensed and transformed into countless living beings, forming extremely sinister and ugly civilizations. All sorts of unimaginable battles took place in various parts of the universe. These various battles had practically exhausted the imaginations of living beings. There were various schemes, ruthless slaughters, and inhumane battles. It caused any virtuous saint to swiftly fall to become a ferocious villain when they arrived here. Could such a universe of negative emotions really be illusory? This was the first time Luo Fan had such a thought. Before this, the entire universe of negative emotions was just an illusion created by his mind. Everything in it was illusory to him, and the truth seemed to prove his feeling. He could destroy this universe of negative emotions, he could change it, and he could twist it as he pleased. After twisting it, it would collapse and be destroyed directly. All of this seemed to be completely idealistic, and was born from the fluctuations of his mind. Or rather, it could be said that the negative emotions were directly projected into his mind and created all sorts of illusions. However, this time, after sensing the existence of a supreme powerhouse that seemed to be both a false saint and a true saint in the depths of this universe of negative emotions, he suddenly realized that it was difficult for him to maintain his previous thoughts. It's really an illusory world. Could it be that such an existence can be born? As he thought this, the divine light in his eyes became a little distant. Vaguely, he felt that he seemed to have touched upon some extremely deeply hidden secret. These thoughts did not linger in his mind for too long. Not long after, he had already dispelled all these thoughts and allowed his mind to return to a calm state. No matter what secret it was, whether this universe of negative emotions was real or illusory, it did not matter to him now. To him, the most important thing right now was to reconnect with his own body so that his soul could escape from this universe of negative emotions and become one with his body once more. Only then would he truly be able to make that newly appeared primordial essence, spirit treasure fragment his own. With a thought, he chose the weakest place in this universe of negative emotions and took a step forward. His mind had already arrived there. The weakest place in this space naturally could not be on the planet. It was in the middle of the void. The root of everything in the universe of negative emotions was negative emotions. The planet was an aggregation formed by the condensation and compression of negative emotions. If he stayed on the planet, it would be equivalent to staying on an aggregation of negative emotions. The impact of negative emotions would exceed that of any void. If Luo Fan wanted to change the entire universe of negative emotions and turn it into a universe of positive emotions, he would naturally need to choose this aggregation to take action. Through this aggregation, it would spread out and change more and more spacetime. Finally, it would be possible to completely change the entire universe of negative emotions. However, he did not want to do this right now. Therefore, choosing the planet where the negative emotions condensed was the worst and most foolish choice for him, even if he didn't go anywhere. Staying in the previous location was better than choosing any other planet. Arriving at the weakest place in this space, Luo Fan directly sat down cross-legged. He began to slowly exercise his mind, causing his mind to radiate wave after wave of inexplicable fluctuations during this process. This inexplicable fluctuation came from his worldview. It was the most fundamental characteristic of the worldview and contained the fundamental elements of the worldview. This fluctuation came from a completely different dimension from the surrounding negative emotions. Although it radiated out, it did not have any effect on the surrounding negative emotions. It was as if the surrounding universe of negative emotions was simply illusory and did not exist at all. When this fluctuation radiated out, Luo Fan slowly closed his eyes and carefully savored the feedback of that fluctuation, the worldview. This was the most fundamental cultivation foundation of Luo Fan. Although this foundation did not completely become the main body of his flesh and blood body, it had completely integrated with his body. It had completely fused with the body, but after all, it had already occupied the position of the foundation and was deeply engraved in the body. Under such circumstances, his body, his physical body, would naturally resonate with the fluctuations that came from the fundamental principles of the world of laws. This kind of resonance was extremely fundamental. It was enough to penetrate all universes and all space-time barriers. In other words, this kind of resonance was enough to reconnect Luo Fan's mind and body, and then turn it into a bridge for his mind to leave this universe of negative emotions and return to his body, of course. His body did not integrate deeply with the worldview after all. The resonance with the fluctuation produced by the worldview was certainly not very strong. Coupled with the fact that they were separated by a universe of negative emotions, it would not be easy to make the resonance strong enough for Luo Fan to notice and finally build a bridge. Luo Fan had already expected this. At this time, there was no impatience in his heart, nor was there any trace of negative emotions. He was very clear that in this universe of negative emotions, once negative emotions were produced, there was a great possibility that they would be infected by the entire universe and eventually become a part of the negative emotions. From then on, they would sink into it and would never be able to transcend in this process. Time slowly passed. In a trance, it seemed that tens of millions of years had passed. On this day, Luo Fan was using this fluctuation to constantly radiate and search for resonance. Suddenly, a strange touch appeared in his heart. This touch was so subtle, but so obvious. Like a sudden clap of thunder, it instantly made Luo Fan feel that his heart had suddenly lit up. Found it! A thought suddenly emerged in his mind. With this thought in mind, he quickly focused all his fluctuations on the spot that made him feel something. He felt a faint resonance appear in the center of his fluctuations. As he concentrated the fluctuations, the resonance increased rapidly. A faintly discernible outline appeared in his mind. This is my body. This realization caused a faint smile to appear on Luo Fan's face. At this moment, a change suddenly occurred in the entire universe of negative emotions. Under this change, the entire universe of negative emotions suddenly began to tremble more and more violently. Due to this tremor, all the planets in the universe started to move. Boundless light rapidly evolved into all sorts of incredible light shadows that rapidly converged on the spot that resonated with Luo Fan. At this moment, an indescribable sense of crisis was born in Luo Fan's heart. This is not good. My body is incompatible with this universe of negative emotions. Now that my aura has appeared here, it has caused the entire universe of negative emotions to riot. At this moment, Luo Fan's mind raced and he understood what was going on. His body was neutral and peaceful. There were negative emotions and positive emotions within it. This combination seemed to be incompatible with the entire universe of negative emotions. The appearance of its aura here was like the contact between matter and antimatter. It was bound to erupt with an earth-shattering change. After understanding this, how could Luo Fan dare to stay here? With a thought, his figure broke through the endless negative emotions and quickly moved toward the location of his body. At this moment, figures appeared beside Luo Fan one by one. These figures, all of them had ruthless expressions on their faces, and their bodies were emitting naked hatred and a desire to destroy. When he saw them, Luo Fan's expression changed slightly. It was not because of how ugly these figures were, nor was it because of how strong their ruthlessness and desire to destroy were. It was because of the appearance of these figures. Surprisingly, these figures were all people that Luo Fan knew. Some of them had died in his hands, some of them had been defeated by him, and some of them had been injured by him. For example, Zhu Huang, Guan Huang, Zi Huang, and many other supreme sovereigns. All of them appeared here, densely surrounding his body. Each of them was preparing to launch an extremely powerful attack at him. This universe of negative emotions is really not simple. At this moment, Luo Fan only had this thought in his mind. Among these creatures, some were already dead while some were still alive. However, they were here. There was no difference between them. Each and every one of them was many times stronger than when they encountered Luo Fan. Every one of them, their auras were enough to threaten him and affect him. Die! A loud roar burst out of nowhere. Following that, an endless barrage of attacks engulfed him from all directions. Here, Luo Fan did not have the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, nor did he have the fragment of the chaotic origins spiritual treasure. All he had was his spirit, his understanding of cultivation, the great Tao, heaven and earth, and the state of chaos. All he had was his worldview. Under such circumstances, facing the endless attacks in front of him, he felt an unprecedented sense of danger. In a trance, he was even at a loss for what to do. He could not effectively respond to what was happening in front of him. In the end, he relied on his own instincts to dodge 90% of the attacks. This was already extremely heaven-defying. If this was known to others, it would be enough to make any supreme sovereign exclaim in admiration. However, apart from this 90%, the remaining 10% of the attacks bombarded his body without any obstruction and were devoured by him without any reservations. Judging from the number of enemies that Luo Fan had encountered in the countless years he had been cultivating, just this 10% of the attacks was already an astronomical number, enough to make any supreme sovereign despair. Puff, 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 puff. Amidst the indescribably terrifying sounds, Luo Fan felt endless pain rising from the bottom of his heart. This pain was so intense and so terrifying that it felt like his body was being ground apart bit by bit from the outside to the inside. Is this it? A thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. As he thought of this, His spirit shattered bit by bit, turning into fireworks and gradually dissipating amidst the endless attacks. His consciousness became more and more blurry and hazy. More and more thoughts disappeared from his heart. It was as if he had sunk into a bottomless abyss, the deepest abyss of death. Die. Die. Ha ha. The endless terrifying laughter seemed to become more and more distant, more and more indistinct. Finally, after an unknown period of time, when his spirit shattered to the point where only a tiny trace was left, it seemed as if it would completely disappear. All traces of his existence vanished. An indescribable unwillingness suddenly emerged from that tiny trace. I want to transcend. This most fundamental thought, along with this bit of unwillingness, began to gradually condense. This caused the trace, which had been shattered to the extreme and was about to be completely erased, to stop its disappearing trend. In fact, it even started to become clearer and more obvious. An indescribable light began to appear in this bit of thought. As the light shone, more and more spirit fragments gathered around it. Chapter 1697. With this most fundamental transcendent will, Luo Fan's mind gradually condensed again. And the worldview that was born along with the transcendent will that completely belonged to him and was completely independent from the understanding of the world of any other living beings and existences also reappeared in his mind. The appearance of these two was like a stabilizing needle that firmly fixed his mind in the entire universe of negative emotions. No matter how the countless terrifying emperors attacked him, no matter how the power of the entire universe of negative emotions crushed him, it could not shake his spirit in the slightest, it could not make his spirit crumble. After experiencing destruction and annihilation, the moment his world view appeared, it naturally had a kind of transcendence of nirvana and rebirth. Indistinctly, it had already integrated all of his past comprehensions and gains from the foundation. There was no longer any gap between his heart and this worldview, not even the slightest gap. The recovery of his mind was equivalent to the growth of the worldview of laws. Any growth of the worldview of laws would naturally transform into the recovery of his mind in this way. They complemented and promoted each other, but the result was that Luo Fan's mind began to grow crazily during this process. It didn't take long for it to grow from a state that was about to be annihilated to a state that was even stronger than the little bit of clarity he had before. Moreover, in the blink of an eye, he had already crossed this level and began to frantically evolve towards a complete state. The whole process was unimaginably fast. In just a few breaths of time, Luo Fan's mind had already appeared in the universe of negative emotions, standing among the many enemies he had once fought. He looked at the many living beings with an inexplicable expression. Compared to before, his current mind constantly revealed a kind of transcendent charm, constantly revealing an aura that was independent of all things in the world, independent of all worlds, and even independent of the state of chaos. This was none other than the aura released by his worldview of laws, which had perfectly fused with his mind. At this moment, his mind was already equivalent to the worldview of laws. As for his worldview, it had already become part of his heart. This kind of light that belonged to the world of rules was not very strong. However, it kept spreading in all directions, turning more and more of the universe of negative emotions around him into a part of him. He gradually changed its nature. Even though it's only the images of the many living beings and the attacks of the many living beings, it's still not enough. However, you are nothing more than negative emotions. There is no difference between you and everything else in this universe of negative emotions. The impact you have on me is nothing. It won't be any different from everything else around us. Luo Fan looked at the many creatures around him. However, he said so. Following his words, the light emitted from his body. It became more and more penetrating. The surrounding light became more penetrating, and those who were enveloped by the light began to tremble. Naturally, the many living beings turned illusory. They became blurry and gradually looked like phantoms, turning into illusory objects. At this moment, all of the living beings were howling out crazily. All kinds of attacks that were either familiar or unfamiliar to Luo Fan surged out from their bodies. However, these attacks could no longer be compared to the attacks that completely destroyed Luo Fan's mind. They couldn't even make him feel any pressure anymore. In his mind, these attacks were just ordinary surges of negative emotions. Even though they were unimaginably powerful, they were still just negative emotions. All kinds of attacks still acted on his mind. They still relied on the power of his mind to shake himself and destroy himself. As long as he could recognize the truth and see the truth, he would be able to avoid this kind of influence. He would be able to deal with them like he dealt with ordinary negative emotions. Dealing with ordinary negative emotions was obviously a simple matter for Luo Fan. It was precisely because of this that all these things happened here at this moment. After sighing, Luo Fan said, "Disperse." As he said this, the light emitted from his body trembled slightly. Immediately after, the endless figures around him collapsed and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. At the same time, Luo Fan sensed that the place that resonated with the fluctuations of the world became unprecedentedly clear. It was so clear that he felt that he only needed to take a step forward to instantly see that thing. With a thought, he raised his hand and gently patted the void in front of him. In an instant, a door appeared in front of him. Behind that door was an aura that he was extremely familiar with. It was the kind of existence that was incomparably compatible with his mind and could even be called the home of his mind. That was obviously his body. After discovering the existence of his body, he naturally wouldn't stay here any longer. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had already crossed the door and entered the body of the heavenly monarch. Just as he left the universe of negative emotions, two pairs of eyes suddenly landed on him. The two gazes were so powerful and so terrifying that under their gaze, Luo Fan felt as if his whole body had begun to tremble, and he felt as if his soul was about to be completely crushed into dust by these gazes in the next moment. This is the existence that is suspected to be a true saint. At this moment, such a thought instantly emerged in his mind. Immediately after, the gazes slightly narrowed and disappeared. As soon as the gazes disappeared, Luo Fan felt inexplicably relaxed all over his body. Immediately after, the feeling of negative emotions had completely disappeared, as if they had never existed. Everything that had happened before, it was as if it was just a dream, just an illusory illusion. What's going on here? Is he a true saint or a false saint? This doubt instantly emerged in Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, there was a sudden cracking sound around him. In this sound, countless cracks suddenly appeared on the two palms formed by the power of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and the essence of the innate inextinguishable essence. Immediately after, in front of him, they suddenly collapsed and disappeared. It was as if they had never appeared before. And at this moment, Luo Fan felt his palms sink, and an item appeared in his hand. It was an irregular cone-shaped item. On it, there was a kind of eternal and indestructible aura, and there was a kind of charm that Luo Fan was very familiar with. Obviously, this item was none other than the fragment of the primordial spiritual treasure. Or rather, it was after it had grown. The fragment of the primordial spiritual treasure. On this fragment, Luo Fan could even see traces of the V-shaped fragment of ambition. From this, it could be seen that this fragment was formed from the V-shaped fragment that had been supplemented with new fragments. And the power that caused him to run for his life and almost lose all of his strength to the point that his two palms collapsed was clearly from this fragment in front of him. After understanding this, his heart skipped a beat. The time that had passed before emerged in his mind. Only for a moment? In an instant, Luo Fan understood how much time had passed in the outside world when he was thrown into the universe of negative emotions. I have clearly been there for at least tens of thousands of years. Such a thought flashed in his mind. He couldn't help but smile bitterly. Ever since he discovered this innate, inextinguishable spiritual light, He was the one who was unpredictable every time he faced an enemy. He was the one who could easily use some means to play with the opponent in the palm of his hand, and make the opponent unknowingly act according to his will. But this time, on the contrary, he became the one who felt that his opponent was unpredictable. He became the one who couldn't see what kind of means his opponent used, and what kind of methods his opponent used. This kind of contrast made him a little unable to react for a while. With a slight sigh, Luo Fan looked at the man in front of him. After losing the power of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light and the powerful palm that was condensed from the essence of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, the man's face had already become quite ugly. I didn't expect this fragment to actually take the initiative to summon other fragments. It seems that the fragment you obtained before is at least the core of a true divine treasure, the man said with an ugly expression. The core of a true divine treasure? Luo Fan heard and shook his head. Why do you think about things related to true divine with the way of thinking below true divine? The man's face changed when he heard this. For existences below true divine, this kind of push is naturally very reasonable, and can even be said to be completely correct. However, that is only for existences below true divine. For existences of true divine level, how do you know whether this is the case or not? True divine itself is a level beyond our understanding, Luo Fan said faintly. The man's eyes revealed a kind of sudden realization. Obviously, he had already agreed with what Luo Fan had said. After a moment of silence he said, "You have passed my test. I, the Extreme King, admit that you have the right to keep the inextinguishable spiritual light. Goodbye." With that, he turned around to leave. Seeing him leave just like that, Luo Fan just coldly smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist attacked me like this twice, causing me to fall into a predicament where I almost died twice. Don't tell me you want to end everything with just one sentence?" The Extreme King's face changed as he turned to look at Luo Fan and said, "Do you really think that you have already won? Of course not. How can it be considered a victory without making you pay the price?" Luo Fan said faintly. As he spoke, the spiritual light on his body flowed into the inextinguishable spiritual treasure fragment in his hand. The fragment began to shake violently, and the shadow of a six-fingered palm suddenly appeared from the fragment and pounced towards the Extreme King. Before he entered the universe of negative emotions, his body and mind were already extremely tired. He was on the verge of losing all of his strength, and this clone was completely destroyed. However, after going through the tempering of the universe of negative emotions, his spirit had reached a whole new level. At this moment, the power of his spirit was several times stronger than before. Moreover, because he had completely integrated with the world of laws, his strength had received a huge improvement. Because of that, the spiritual light in his body naturally grew. In the end, his strength that was nearing its end was completely replenished. It could even be said that he had taken another step forward. Therefore, at this time, he was in peak condition. Naturally, he could activate the traces of the true divine in the fragment and use it against his opponent. Seeing this shadow, the Extreme King's face changed. He let out a light shout and a long river rushed out of his body. In the air, it turned into two palms. They met the six-fingered palm. These two palms were much weaker than the two palms from before. Whether it was the strength or the way the palms changed, they were all the same. But, after all, the palms were condensed from the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and the essence of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. The method of using it was also comprehended from the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Its power was also extremely strong. It could be said that it was extremely terrifying. Under such circumstances, the two palms met the shadow of the six-fingered palm. However, it did not collapse immediately. Instead, the six-fingered palm changed into dozens of attacks. In the end, it condensed into a hand seal that surpassed the understanding of Luo Fan and the man. Then, it took the opportunity to smash the two palms. Next, it went one step further and probed forward. In an instant, the man's body was completely shattered. All traces of the man's existence were erased in an instant. They were completely erased in an instant, disappearing without a trace. After doing all this, Luo Fan's body flickered, and he quickly brought the primordial spiritual treasure fragment into the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Then, the essence of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light took effect. It instantly cut off the connection between the six-fingered palm and the fragment. Before, when Luo Fan activated the six-fingered palm, he had already anticipated this step. He allowed the six-fingered palm to be connected to the fragment at all times. The six-fingered palm itself was only an illusory appearance, and it was completely controlled by the fragment. Therefore, at this time, the connection between the fragment and the six-fingered palm was cut off. Naturally, the six-fingered palm that was planning to continue to wreak havoc and change the world shook slightly. Then, the six-fingered palm suddenly collapsed. It turned into countless fine light fragments that scattered in all directions and disappeared without a trace. It seems that if I want to activate the fragment's strongest power, I still need the help of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Otherwise, I won't be able to stop this change at all. Luo Fan sighed. At this moment, the fragment in his hand jumped for a while before it stopped. It seemed to be a little insatiable. However, after knowing what the result of the fragment's full power would be, its behavior could no longer make Luo Fan feel any sympathy. Thus, at this moment, he casually pressed his hand down and put the fragment into his universe in his sleeve. At this moment, he no longer hesitated. With a thought, his main body and clone exerted force at the same time, and space-time started to shift. As the connate inextinguishable spiritual light shifted, it started to traverse space-time continuously and headed towards where his main body was. It seems that no one can stop me this time. This thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, just as the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was about to traverse space-time to where his main body was, he suddenly felt the surrounding space-time shift inexplicably change. An indescribable distortion suddenly took effect on the surrounding space-time, making him feel that he was actually getting further and further away from where his main body was. It seems that I spoke too early. Luo Fan could only smile helplessly at this moment. Even an ordinary person could see that someone else had interfered and shifted the connate inextinguishable spiritual light to another location, let alone Luo Fan. At this moment, he took a step forward and his figure had already left the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. He directly appeared in the middle of the ring formed by the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. As he suppressed this place, the surrounding space-time, which was constantly changing and shifting towards a completely unfamiliar place, suddenly distorted. In the end, with a slight tremble, it left the state of shifting space-time and appeared in a space-time that was completely unfamiliar to Luo Fan. Of course, this space-time was completely unfamiliar to Luo Fan, and it should also be completely unfamiliar to the other party. After arriving here, Luo Fan took out the fragment of the primordial spiritual treasure without hesitation. He could not hide from his opponent here. For someone who could interfere when his clone and his main body were shifting space-time together, it was impossible for him to escape. To be able to change the direction of the shift, it had to be at least a level 3 Supreme Emperor who had refined the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. And this kind of existence clearly knew that he was here. Wanting to attack him here was just a matter of a thought. All he could do was to prepare as soon as possible and prepare to attack before the opponent arrived. Instead of fleeing like a stray dog as expected, just as the fragment of the primordial spiritual treasure appeared in Luo Fan's hand, the space-time in front of him twisted, and then the figure of an old man appeared. Gradually he appeared there. This old man's entire body was filled with an aura that was even stronger than that of the man he had encountered before. It was an aura that was eternal and indestructible. The light of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light that lingered around his body was even more obvious than that of the man from before. That was also the extreme emperor. It had to be more obvious and more dazzling. Obviously. Just from this appearance, one could already tell that Yi Zichen was a saint. This old man's mastery of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was stronger than that of the extreme emperor. Moreover, it was a lot stronger. However, this also meant that the challenge that Luo Fan encountered was more difficult and more difficult to overcome. With his previous experience, Luo Fan didn't plan on speaking at all. As he saw this old man appear, his thoughts stirred and the primordial essence spirit treasure fragment in his hand suddenly shook. A brilliant light emerged, condensing into a six-fingered palm in the air. This palm formed a seal in midair, and then slammed down at the old man. The old man had already prepared to attack. Although the six-fingered palm came in a hurry, it did not have much effect on him. At this moment, a handprint appeared on his body. It was a claw that made this handprint. It only had 4 fingers, but they shone with an eternal and inextinguishable luster. Every movement was exquisite and mysterious, to the point that even Luo Fan could not understand it. The handprint made by the claw was mysterious. After it appeared, it naturally suppressed time and space, causing endless cracks to appear in the surrounding space. In the end, it turned into billions of fragments that rushed in all directions. They turned into smoke and surrounded the handprint. Under the effect of the handprint's power, the smoke continued to condense into all kinds of unimaginable light and shadow. It turned into an unimaginable attack that accompanied the handprint and blasted towards the six-fingered palm. This is a simulation of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. However, it is tens of thousands of times stronger than my simulation. At this moment, such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. With his eyesight, he could see at a glance that the claw that shot out from the old man's body was not the one that the extreme emperor had used before. It was not the one that was formed by the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and the essence of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Instead, it was completely formed by the imitation of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light with its own power. The reason why the strange appearance of the claw was that the old man had dug out from the depths of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. The structure of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was deeply carved into the foundation of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. It was as if every perfect world had a connate Taoist body that was different from most other perfect worlds. The foundation of every connate inextinguishable spiritual light had a structure that could bring out the strongest power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. This structure was equivalent to the connate Taoist body of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. It was obvious that the old man's spiritual light was the palm of his born Taoism aptitude that had appeared in front of Luo Fan at this moment. The appearance of the 4-fingered claw, of course. The structure of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was still different from the connate Taoist body of the perfect world. The connate Taoist body of the perfect world was the image of the existence that created the perfect world. However, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was different. It was an existence that was born from chaos. If there was a creator, it would be in a state of chaos. It was not a living creature, and it had no form. Therefore, the structure of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was naturally not the image of the existence that created it.